Good morning and welcome members and the public to the 25th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. As usual, can I remind those present to switch off mobile phones and Blackberries and other wireless devices, as they can often interfere with the sound system. Members of the public may also have noticed that some members and officials are using tablet devices. This is instead of hard copies to their papers. We have apologies this morning from Richard Simpson, and in turn can I welcome Malcolm Chisholm to the committee as a Labour Party substitute. I also welcome Rhoda Grant, who joins the committee replacing Drew Smith. The first item on the agenda today is to give new members and substitutes an opportunity to declare any interests relevant to the work of the committee, and I will invite them in turn. Rhoda Grant.
I don't think I've got relevant interests to declare, but I would make a voluntary declaration of my Unison membership.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald, who...
I would just direct members to my register of interest, but I don't believe I have anything relevant to the committee to declare.
Thank you, Mark. And Malcolm Chisholm.
Again, I would just state what's in my written register of interest. I'm a member of Unison and the EIS.
Thank you. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is to consider 3 negative instruments, statutory instruments. The first instrument is Public Health, etc. Scotland Act 2008 Sunbed Amendment Regulations 2013 SSI 2013-201. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has not drawn to the attention of the Parliament the instrument. If there is no comment from members, I will put the question, which is the statutory instrument laid before you. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. The second instrument is Sale of Tobacco Prescribed Documents Scotland Regulations 2013, SSI 2013-202. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and the Law Reform Committee has not drawn the attention of the Parliament to the instrument. If there are no comments from the members, I will put the question, which is that. I presume there isn't any comments from the members? No. I put the SSI laid before you. Do we have the committee agreement? Thank you. That is agreed. The third instrument is Contaminants in Food Scotland Regulations 2013 SSI 2013-217. There has been no motion to annul, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has not drawn the attention of the Parliament to the instrument. Are there any comments from the committee? Therefore, I will put the question, which is the SSI laid before you. Do we all agree? Thank you. That's all agreed. Agenda item number 3, which is the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill, is to continue our evidence taking at stage 1. Our first panel today is of academic experts. Welcome. And we have Andrew Eccles, Glasgow School of Social Work, and Professor Alison Petch, Director of Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services. Do you wish to make any introductory remarks or comments at this point? Or
nope. Nope.
We okay
I'm
then?
Happy to move to questions.
Right, fine, that's good. Can we have Annette Millen for the committee's first question, please, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning. My question initially to Mr Eccles, but if Professor Petch wants to say anything later, that would be fine. I'm interested, you've had an interest in the role of interprofessional working in health and social care.
Yes.
And I wonder if you'd like to make any comments on how important you see that, in getting this legislation.
Well, I mean, the first thing is I think it's very important to have interprofessional working. I think a lot of it goes on already in a variety of forms. So I have a concern about using a sledgehammer to crack a nut sometimes with this in terms of organisation or major structural reform. I think there is variable ways in which interprofessional working takes place in different localities, which we should recognise that exists. But otherwise, it's absolutely crucial. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in the room would probably think otherwise. Probably it's a question of how do we best do this and how do we learn from the experience of what was attempted, certainly over the last decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, I too am interested. I mean, I have a health background myself, and I'm well aware that there can be issues between health professionals and social care professionals or social work professionals. And I think for integration to work properly, that culture has to be. They have to amalgamate.
I agree with you. I think also it's probably worth bearing in mind there are also tensions between different health professionals as well, historically, between acute and primary, between allied health professions and other practitioners as well. And my experience of having worked doing quite a bit of research with on the front line with practitioners is that, again, that's a complex and an uneven process. I've worked with teams where the relationship between health and social work was frankly excellent. But in that same team, there were real tensions between different aspects of health. So again, it adds there's a sense in which we maybe try and reduce this to divisions across different professions, but sometimes it can be a good deal more complex than that.
Has your research revealed any particular reasons for this, or is it really down to personalities and sort of local circumstances?
I think it can be down to personalities. I think some reasons that emerge are the other agendas that are existing at the same time. So, for example, when I was doing the research some years ago, there was the whole agenda for change within the healthcare system, which preoccupied a lot of people, and therefore there was a sense in which people were being pulled in different directions at the same time in terms of where they might put their energies. And again, that would be a long-standing issue with, I think, any form of organisation or structural or whatever change within interprofessional working. Is that it's, the context and the other agendas that might be around are pretty important in terms of being able to get this to work. There is a classic issue over value bases between social work and health. I see the BMA's submission to your committee last year raised a point about value bases, medical models, social models. These are old arguments. And again, I don't think that's an insurmountable issue. I think that for me, one of the key issues is that people are able to belong in organisations that genuinely are learning organisations, maybe as opposed to training organisations. So when I look at the legislation that's proposed now, I'm looking again at organisational issues or issues of procedure to some extent. I'm thinking the key issue here again will be working cultures. It'll be about spending time and effort in getting people to understand where each other is coming from, to develop trust, which is a key issue. And that will be more important than organisational or procedural shifts.
So are you really saying that can't be legislated for? Or do you think this legislation will be effective in bringing that about?
I think I think it requires a recognition of the fact that that's not an easy process. That requires time, space. When I say resources, I don't necessarily mean money. I just mean that people actually genuinely. So, for example, quite a bit of my teaching I do is with social work managers, for example, but also health managers as well. And it strikes me that one of the things that becomes very apparent with their organisations is the lack of space. With the best will in the world, people's frontline practice takes up most of their time effectively. So that space to be a learning organisation is often something of a premium.
So even with legislation, I presume you foresee this as being a sort of evolutionary process rather than something.
Yeah. I don't think that you can. I don't think this legislation will guarantee. That would be, I think, a folly to imagine it will guarantee. It requires a more subtle and complex engagement with some of the issues that are well rehearsed in the literature.
Thank you, Professor Petch.
Professor Petch, do you wish to have any?
I mean, I think I would endorse a lot of what Andrew has said, and I think there are some very good examples that when teams are working together at the front line, the sort of traditional barriers tend to melt away. But I think we shouldn't underestimate that certainly there seems to be quite a lot of ignorance amongst different professional groups of what their future partners do. And so some of that is just about increasing people's knowledge and understanding. But also, I think we've got a real challenge to ensure that you know, in times of uncertainty and change, people tend to sort of scuttle back to their sort of tribes, as it were. And I think we need to ensure that, you know, it's the other direction, that people can actually see that through working together, they're actually going to provide better support to the people who all this is for at the end of the day.
We're focused on the transition and a lot of this, and even the submissions. But if this new workforce is to develop and we're going to see more and more care delivered in the community, what do we need to do in the long term to ensure that this new workforce that is growing and working and learning in the community rather than an acute setting or any of the other traditional settings? So there's a big shift here. And if that's to be permanent, what do we need to do to address that now to deal with the beyond the transition?
I think one of the very important things is to separate out what are the unique skills of each different group, and where in fact there can be much more flexible sort of overlap at the boundaries, so that we tend to sort of have had these very distinct professions. I would suggest that in order to, again, focus on the individual and the support they need. You know, we've been talking for years about avoiding having 4, 5, 6 different professions moving into someone's individual home or whatever. So I think we need to be quite clear about where there can be more overlapping, more development of generic working, and where, you know, as for some distinct procedures, there needs to be the distinct professional identity. So I think it's about a reshaping of the workforce and also ensuring that there is a commonality amongst the workforce in focusing on the individual. I mean, at the moment, we tend to have all sorts of disjunctures between hospital, between community, between different professional groups within the community, and that is what often gets in the way of the delivery that's needed.
Sorry, go on.
Just to ask, do you think that the proposed legislation does enough to bring all these relevant groups together, particularly at local level? And how do you see sort of leadership coming, if it's going to work?
I think you've put your finger on it. I mean, the legislation per se is not going to make any of this happen. I mean, I hope that the fact that the legislation is here will give a raised profile, the requirements, will ensure that there is a focus on trying to get this right. But it is not the legislation that will deliver. It's the leadership. It's having the vision of why on earth we're doing this anyway. It's not about moving, you know, the chess pieces around the board. It's about trying to facilitate the best mechanisms for delivery. And I think I would just be, you know, absolutely certain that we mustn't get bogged down in the architecture and the mechanisms. We must, and, you know, this is a much more challenging area, but we must try and sort of infect everyone with the enthusiasm, the vision of what this can do to make, you know, a decent quality of life for people, and identify the sort of shared communal leadership that hopefully can move that forward.
Yeah, I think this is, I agree with Alison entirely actually on the question of leadership, which I think was inconsistent or has been inconsistent over the last decade. So again, in areas of doing research, it's quite clear that some people had bought into this much more than others. Some people regarded it as a process they had to do. Others were much more enthusiastic. And the evidence of that is clear on the ground, I think, in different areas. I agree with Alison on the idea of generic working, but fundamentally, there are, again, substantial areas where social workers, for example, and people in health fundamentally do different things. And I think people need to feel that those are not going to be impinged upon in terms of professional skills. And it is interesting because some people regarded even quite small shifts in their working patterns in terms of assessment, for example, as de-skilling. Other people thought it was reskilling, other people thought it was de-skilling, and that there was no common denominator. So again, it's a pretty sensitive issue in that sense. So I don't think it's a question of I think it's a question probably actually of not having people thinking they're going to end up as being generic workers, but there is that gap, that space where things can be done on a more generic way, but actually still holding together what I think are quite important value bases that exist across health and social care.
Okay, thank you.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. Just listening to what you've said and following on from that, what you both seem to be telling us is the legislation won't hamper the process, but it won't make it happen. I'm not sure if that's...
I don't think the legislation will axiomatically make this happen, and actually some of that is based on a merit of the legislation, which is the idea that there should be some degree of, to use probably an overused phrase, local ownership, which I think is useful and welcome because people do things in different ways, and there may be particular circumstances in different areas of Scotland where people might want to do things differently. This seems to me perfectly commendable. But in itself, it puts down a marker, but in itself, what is proposed in terms of structures or organisation or procedures, or indeed what will ultimately be outcomes, won't in itself shift this. It has to be about, I think, leadership buying into this to a much larger extent.
But is there anything in the legislation as it's drafted to stop this happening? Is there anything that's maybe too top-down? I think you said previously that top-down could be problematic.
I would have caution about outcome measures. There is a wealth of literature which suggests that using outcome measures can be counterproductive. There's some very fine work on this. Toby Lowe's work in Newcastle University, I think, is particularly good on this. And the outcome measures in themselves can often be quite counterproductive because people will actually, of course, meet the outcomes or measure the measurable, in other words. And there's a possibility that then starts to stifle some interesting experimental work or people doing things in quite different ways at local level, because inevitably, if there are outcome measures, people will try and meet the outcomes. So for me, until there's a greater clarity or specification around what these outcomes might be, then that's a potential to be problematic, I think.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I think the outcomes has become very much a sort of buzzword of the moment. And I think what we need to be very clear about is the distinction, is what we mean by outcomes, whether we're talking about outcomes for the individual, whether we're talking about outcomes for communities, whether we're talking about the outcomes of a particular policy. And in relation to integration, I think we need to be very clear that we've got proposed national health and social care integration outcomes, which I think are pretty much going in the right direction. They've got quite an emphasis on the individual. Then we've got organisational outcomes, sort of things like heat targets, single outcome agreements. And then we've got what are most important, which are the outcomes for the individual. And I think there's been a real development over the last 5-10 years in really trying to focus on outcome-based assessment, outcome-based delivery, with the introduction of self-directed support, and I think perhaps even to refer to the previous question about the workforce, we need to remember that that is going to be a major initiative sort of overlaying all this. So I think we've got to be clear when we talk about outcomes, because the danger is otherwise we're just going to get into this sort of land where everyone talks the words, but we're all perhaps not necessarily meaning the same thing.
I suppose for us the challenge is that we know there is an issue, our constituents tell us an issue, the frontline workforce tell us there is an issue because they're more told what they can't do rather than what they can do. If the outcome, if the desired effect is that people live at home healthier, more supported and aren't coming to us to complain, then that would be the outcome. How do we deliver that if it's a cultural change? I mean, we've been talking about this for years and years and years, and it appears very little changes. How do we, I suppose, as politicians, effect that change, make it happen?
I think perhaps I'm just an eternal optimist, but I think there has been quite a movement on that over the last 5-10 years. Joint Improvement Team and their work around personal outcomes, talking points, I mean, I have to declare an interest in that it was some of my colleagues that were involved in this. But I think on the ground, at IRIS, we do quite a lot of work with local partnerships around the delivery of outcomes. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. None of these things are going to happen overnight. But I do think there has been quite a shift, certainly, you know, from 20 years ago when that was never the focus. I think it's just about the pace of change. And perhaps to go back to your initial question about what the bill can do, for me, the most important sort of element of the bill is where you state the integration principles, because I think those principles are good principles. I think perhaps the danger is they get lost in all the discussion about different arrangements and the production of plans and who's going to be the chief officer. And I don't know if there's opportunity to just strengthen those. I know one is limited in legislation in what you can do, but I think getting that message across to people that this isn't just about the mechanics. It is about really trying to deliver on the key principles that are outlined there.
It strikes me that language in this area is pretty important, and it might be interesting to think what we understand by integration as well. There are different models of integration. There's from collaboration to integration. I remember 10 years ago doing some work in collaborative working and being slightly chided by someone saying we're now integrated. And I was thinking, well, clearly that's not the case on the ground because you're not integrated. So there's a sense in which we use these phrases, and I think it would be useful to have a bit more explanatory power for frontline workers about what this might actually mean in terms of their jobs or whatever the case may be, in terms of what they may be expected to do. Because integration is quite a heavy phase, effectively, of people working together, or joint working, or collaboration. Integration we would often regard as one end of a scale or a continuum in that. I think in terms of what we do, if Alison's an optimist, I'm not a pessimist. I am certainly a realist in terms of what I think has been over-ambitious or over-optimism in the past. I think the over-optimism has probably been about the ability of structural change, of organisational change to actually deliver the results. And part of that, I think, is because there's been some linear thinking. If we do X, then Y will follow. But in fact, in the issues that we're dealing with, the interface between health and social care, that's a complex area often, and therefore you can't have that kind of linear thinking that if we do something organisationally or procedurally, then something else will follow from that. It's too complex for that. Alice and I have talked about this before, about this idea of wicked issues that are not always easily solvable, for which there are no standardised patterns for being able to deal with these things, and outcomes will often be quite variable in that sense. And we have to allow that space for that. So if anything, I would say that we need to be realistic about what's achievable here. I think we should certainly have a higher degree of working between health and social care where that's possible. And I think if we learn the lessons of the past, then it's about big ideas that were highly optimistic, but probably needed a good deal more spade work in terms of, or research effectively, in terms of what was likely to actually happen at the end of the day. And I think if you keep that's important, to keep people on side effectively, for people to buy into this. They have to. There's good research work being done, which we're both aware of, which is basically what it needs to have frontline workers to buy in to some of these changes. There's not much point in simply saying you will do this, because it might not make sense in terms. They have to see what the buy-in to that would be. And it's important they have to see that there will be a better outcome as a result of this, rather than simply another set of procedural changes saying these are the ways we're now going to do things. I think that's a cultural shift that's important.
I almost disagree with you in that, because certainly the people coming to me saying we need change, we need better integration, are indeed the frontline workers who are going into somebody's home and can't give them, for instance, a bath because, hey-ho, that is somebody else's job, and that should be what they are doing now for the good of that person. And that happens all the time to frontline workers, that they're given rules and regulations they must follow that tell them what they can't do, and what they see is where the need lies firsthand, because they're the people there in the ground without the scope to do it. The legislation, I think, is trying to aim to do that with integration, but how do we get that almost management level, that to an extent may be empire building and keeping their own responsibilities very close to them. How do we free that up to allow the people on the front line who want to do that?
Well, I think one of the, I mean, if you think back to the previous attempts at this, one of the problems for me would be the outcome measures that were used, which were essentially around, if we go back to the JPAF outcome measures, they were essentially around processes. And I think that's a problem because but also I would say that organisations, certainly in times of fiscal pressure, might start to meet the organisational targets or objectives as a first. So you have to get beyond that particular problem in itself. The early work that was done by Wilkinson and others back at the turn of the century on what was done in England, interviewed chief executives in primary care trusts there, and they were saying that their primary concern was to meet the immediate targets of the organisation effectively, and after that then they might start looking at other areas that they could work in. So it's problematic, I think, partially in a target culture where organisations might be inclined to meet the immediate targets they have rather than something that might be slightly more ambitious in terms of thinking outside the box.
And I think that is critically dependent on having the individuals who see a vision.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure you've heard about the mantra of getting it right for Mrs. Smith, which led one of the developments south of the border. But that was that was what permeated throughout all the professional groups within that area. It became, I mean, I happened to be living down there at the time, and it was on signposts all over the place. And that became a collective vision that we're all in this together, doing it in order to make a decent life for Mrs. Smith, of whom we could all be the Mrs. Smiths of the future. And I think we have to have that transformation from it being delivering on particular targets or, boundaries of who can do what. It really has to be a belief that this can be different and that this can be driven by, and that's, we've got to have the leaders that can do that. I do wonder sometimes if one can make those leaders or if they're just born and innate. But I think that is where people have to have a belief in it and a commitment. It isn't just about working through processes.
I think I agree, and I'd like to go back just to one thing, which is that there will be some work to do, I think, to establish that sense of goodwill to make this work amongst frontline practitioners, given some of the experiences. I think of the Community Healthcare Partnership in Glasgow, which lasted for 4.5 years, effectively. And a lot of frontline, I did some work with some of these CHPs as well, actually, in the early stages of setting these up. And I think the enthusiasm was certainly there, but the tensions were very clear. We didn't rehearse them all here, but they were pretty apparent at the time what they might be. But that's left a set of frontline practitioners who are probably sceptical about this, because they're likely to say, here we go again, effectively, it's another round of this, we're going to start having these structures and procedures. So there is, I think, goodwill, but I think that goodwill has been dented over the last decade, because my own opinion on this would be that the way we attempted this maybe 10 years ago probably was too driven by organisational change, too driven by procedures.
Malcolm, followed by Bob. Doris.
I read about what Professor Petch was talking about, getting it right from Mrs. Smith, and I was very impressed with that. So I wondered, I suppose, I mean, it's not the only example of good practice, but what can we learn from the evidence of where there have been big improvements? Because I think there was evidence there about less emergency admissions and less delayed discharges and all that kind of thing. So we've got the message that it's not structural change in itself, and leadership is what you've mentioned, but maybe you could mention some other things. But I suppose my related question is, although structural change won't cause it, is it a kind of necessary precondition? I mean, for example, getting it right with Mrs. Smith, there was a big organisational change which isn't available in Scotland to a care trust, but is the organisational change part of what's required, or is it totally irrelevant? Because if it's totally irrelevant, I suppose you might say, do we need this bill at all?
My personal opinion is that the jury is still out on whether you actually need elements of structural change. For example, Knowsley is an example where they achieved good outcomes for people without major structural change. I think, in a sense, we have to look beyond the structural change, given it looks as though elements are going to happen, to focus on the things that are necessary. And also, and I think this is very important, to know that it's not an instant process. You know, the Getting It Right for Mrs. Smith development evolved over 10 years. I would be very fearful that there's almost a concern that, right, problem's been around for so long, this time we're going to get it right, we'll have it sorted 12 months down the road. So I think we have to appreciate that it will take time. I think we have to really get the focus on the individual and think about all aspects of their life. And if you think about that, they need housing, which I think is a critical element that tends to get forgotten about. They need training, they need health support, they need social care support. But if you start and think about the individual and all the bits around them, some of these boundaries start to fall away. And you realise that, you know, it's got to be, I know holistic is a much misused phrase, but it's got to be an approach that really takes into consideration what's necessary to deliver that. I think there are some key elements from the past experience of some of the things that can make it work. Dreadful expression, but boundary spanners, leaders that can actually facilitate working across the boundaries of different organisations, paying a lot of attention to the local context. And I think it's good that there's reference in the bill to the localities, but I think it's absolutely essential that people understand the strengths of the local communities as well as their particular needs. And obviously what might work in Orkney or in Highland is not necessarily going to be what works in the middle of Glasgow. And that makes it more difficult because, again, it puts the onus on local leaders to really understand that, to engage with their communities, to build on the, you know, the goodwill and the sort of local facilities, opportunities in order to deliver. So it makes it more complex than having a simple, you know, we'll sort it out by rejigging boundaries and ordaining this, that, and the other. But I think from, you know, there's a pretty strong evidence base from 10, 20 years of the things that can facilitate it, almost regardless of the structures that you have. And that's why the energy shouldn't go into the structures.
I think also that maybe one of the things we tend to do when we hit problems is we reorganize. There's an old phrase that's wrongly attributed to Petronius, I think it was, on that idea that every time we had a problem we seemed to reorganize. But we do that because we're quite good at reorganizing. And so we tend to play to strengths. So in that sense, maybe some of the skills that have developed within health and local authority management in the last 10 or 15 years have been around organisations and structures and meeting targets, or whatever the case may be. And it may well be that that's the skill set that people then fall back on when we ask them to do something involving integrating health and social care to a larger extent. They'll start to think of it in those terms. How could we organise? What procedures could we use? We need some fundamentally different thinking around that. And that's going to be difficult because I don't think given the way that we've organised public policy in the last couple of decades, that there's been a huge amount of encouragement around that kind of out-the-box thinking about that. And I go back again, Alison's point's absolutely right about leadership. The last time this happened, I think there were so many people viewed this quite instrumentally as something that had to be done, but this involves much more about actually purposefully seeing a vision of what could be achievable here and working back from that, and it will take time to do that.
But I suppose, to be fair to Scotland, there's been far less organisational change imposed in Scotland than in England. So I suppose a lot of the changes that have taken place have been local authorities and health boards working out their own arrangements. Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose another view of the bill might be it's not going to make that much difference because it is respecting, to some extent, what's happened and building on what's developed. So, I mean, I hear all that you're saying about don't rely on structural change, but I suppose in terms of the bill, there's two questions. I mean, is there anything in it that's harmful? Let's do no harm. But also, can we introduce into legislation some of the, you know, more fundamental points that you've been making about leadership and culture and so on, or is all that really not the stuff of legislation?
Well, as I read the bill, I see there's, in my reading of it, in proportion to the amount of time that's spent on issues around training, there's quite a lot of proportion spent around to how these structures might look like or the options for structures. And certainly I would like probably to see more emphasis on the idea. I don't think it's about training actually, because I was involved in some training sessions and it didn't seem to me very encouraging sometimes about thinking out the box or whatever. So it's about people having space in organisations to be able to engage in this. So there's lots of very interesting ways you could do this. You could have health workers and social care workers and different elements of health professions coming in, looking at vignettes of patients, deciding what this patient might need, trying to understand through that process, which is quite a long process to do that, what this person might need, and understanding why people think differently. There's lots of interesting ways in which this could be achieved, and it may be that what we need is a little bit of strengthening somewhere about just what, rather than just say there will be training, what this might look like and why it might not be simply the way it was before, but something a good deal more innovative. And there needs to be space for that to happen. I think this is crucial.
I take your point about we've been fairly modest in Scotland in terms of structural change, and I must admit when the proposals came out, I was very pleased that, you know, some of the earlier talk about whole-scale structural change had been put aside. I think after a few months of optimism, I became a little more despondent that despite that, people were tending, as far as I could see, to get bogged down in some of the discussions about who's going to be the chief officer, how we're going to do this, how we're going to do that. And some of my sort of initial enthusiasm faded away. So I would like to see us recapture some of that. The one area where I wonder if something much stronger can be put in the legislation is in respect of the budgets, because a lot of this is going to be absolutely critical in terms of budget pooling. And with the best will in the world, we know that that is what really sends people back to their own little territories, trying to protect their boundaries. And even in some of the submissions that I've looked at to yourselves, there is concern, for example, about protection of health budgets. Now, unless we are really dedicated to getting this shift in the balance of care and to really pooling for the support that is necessary to prevent those unnecessary admissions to hospital, those are the things where, unless we crack those, a lot of this will just be sort of frills around the edges. So if there's anything that can be done to overcome some of these sort of somewhat permissive and vague elements of what comes particularly from the acute health budget, I think that would really strengthen. I would also like to see more specific reference to the housing function, because, I mean, I was always taught that, you know, the whole delivery depended on 3 equal inputs of health, social care and housing. And I feel our 3-legged stool, as we used to talk about it, is actually in dire danger of becoming a 2-legged one. So those are the 2 elements that I would like to see to strengthen what is there.
Well, I mean, I think that's the last point will feature prominently in that whole issue about the acute budgets, but I won't pursue that at the moment since others want to question, I think.
Bob Doris, followed by Mark McDonald.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I think Mr Eccles said that leadership in health and social care integration had been inconsistent in the last decade or so. I'm also very sensitive to the respecting of local democracy for our councils, but I have constituents who do quite regularly come to my surgery, and the malaise, sometimes the breakdown in relationship between need for, say, residential care for an elderly relative, their frequent in-out visits to hospital, and it doesn't always seem to be joined up. The caveat, I would say, there are some really fantastic local practice on the ground in Glasgow, but it doesn't quite seem to be connected quite the way it should be. So as someone in Scotland's Parliament, I'm talking about the need, whether there's a need for this legislation or not. I know it's not about structures, I know it's about outcomes for the individual. Is the time right to legislate, or do you think we should wait for another 10, 15, 20 years for some parts of Scotland to get on with the integration exercise, which I guess would be hoping they'd be doing anyway without the need for legislation? So I'll come back and ask whether you think the legislation is proportionate or not in a second, but just in terms of the need for legislation, given the fact that it's not just about structures, but the structures there to enable other things to happen, is the time right for legislation in the first place?
Yes, I think because it puts down a marker, which I think is really important, that this hasn't gone off the agenda. So I go back to, I mean, if you think it's a decade, slightly more than that, 12 years effectively since this last round, effectively of trying to establish some of these issues before, I think there's a concern that this then starts to disappear off the agenda. So it puts down a marker. There's no harm in doing that effectively. And the bill itself, it strikes me as open enough to interpretation in terms of what localities might do, that would be a useful thing. I think, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind also that integration, it's not a panacea. It will make things better on the ground, one imagines, if it's done well. But there exists alongside that a whole range of issues in terms of unmet need, in terms of budgets, and I think there's been essentially some slightly wishful thinking in the past that if we get this right, then effectively these issues will disappear. But I suspect your constituents will still be coming to you, even if we did get this right 5 years down the line effectively, because some of the other fiscal pressures are certainly not going to disappear.
If you'd asked me 12 months ago, I would probably have said no. I think now the process is too far to stop. I think, therefore, one has to capitalise on the opportunities of it in the ways that we've been describing, and really try and home in on those elements, particularly the acute transition and the transitions from hospital to community. I think it should be seen as a final attempt, a final opportunity to get it right. I think if people don't seize this opportunity, the cynicism and scepticism in the future will be very great. And I think it'd be very difficult to revisit this, given the history we've already had in terms of this. But I think if you were now to withdraw from it, I think some of the energy and sort of the seeing it as a catalyst for those areas which perhaps haven't been at the forefront would be lost. So I think it's too late to retreat from it.
But I would add to that again, I think for me an important aspect of this is the expectation that government may have of what can be achieved here. And that's not to say that we shouldn't push this and we shouldn't try and hope for things to develop from this, but it seems to me that if we look at a history of this, then one of the problems has been people having a sense of being over-ambitious in terms of what this might achieve, and I think that would scupper it effectively. So we need to think about this a bit more carefully, a bit more in terms of a longer term, and be acutely aware that there are areas of Scotland where there's some truly excellent working between health and social care at local levels, and other areas where, for whatever reason, and it might be previous attempts, then there's a degree of scepticism around that. So people are in different places. And I think one thing that would kill it effectively, if you want to talk about the legislative process, would be expectations that wouldn't necessarily match where areas necessarily are at the moment in terms of what the outcomes might be.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of whether the bill is proportionate or not, I know much of the submissions have focused on structures. Now, my reading of the bill and I guess the political narrative that's went around it is it's not really been about structures, yes, structures have to be established and they have to be signed off and they have to be proportionate, but it's about using those structures for the strategic commissioning of services, for a more joined up working approach, which is actually happening in some parts of the country already, but not in other parts. And I suppose my hope would be that this piece of legislation ensures this happens in all parts of the country in a more speedy and strategic way. So in terms of I don't want to draw you too much in the structures of it, but in terms of how it is laid out within the bill, do you think the level of detail is proportionate?
I mean, I think I would repeat what I was saying earlier, that if you can really beef up some of the underpinning principles, and to the extent that you can introduce into legislation some of the much more important areas that we've been discussing, because I think, you know, it may well be that in people's minds it's not about structures, but if you just look at the bare bones of the bill, inevitably it tends to talk about the need to produce a plan, the need to have certain... Now, I mean, if you think back, we had community care plans and people spent inordinate amounts of time in the production of the plans. The really critical thing is whether you then go out and do something differently. So you can't legislate for implementation, but you can certainly perhaps draft some phrasing, I'm not an expert at all in this, that tries to reinforce the message that you've just given, that, you know, we recognise it's not about structures, because I think people can look at the bare bones and feel, well, that may be some of what people are saying, but at the end, I don't see much of that reflected in that. I think if you go to the, you know, the memorandum and so on, it does tend to emerge more strongly. But I think that's the danger of a bare bone bill. So I mean, I think there have been moves in the past to have much more sort of conversational introductions, and I don't know if that's a possibility.
I think that's an interesting point, actually, because I mean, I suspect the bare boneness of the bill is precisely not to get locked into a kind of top-down heavy approach telling organisations how they're going to do things, especially given the quite different stages in different areas of Scotland. The danger of that is that you end up with something that's too light, effectively, in terms of prescribing. And I certainly wouldn't be prescribing necessarily in terms of procedures. And again, I have real caution about what the outcome measures for this might be. But I'd like to see if there was more weight on a recognition, which, as Alison says, is to some extent in the memorandum, but I'd like to see more weight on a recognition of learning from some of the research that's been done on this in the last 10 or 15 years, and maybe emphasise a little bit more about if it is light on structures and organisation, although it's certainly still in there, then what is it that's missing in there that maybe needs to be in about the idea of cultural change, which I think is such an important issue.
I think those last couple of comments we've had from both of you kind of leads me towards thinking the bill probably is proportionate, particularly Professor Petch, who has, I think the second time now you've said you'd like to see more about the principles of integration on the face of the bill. And I'm minded, we have an evidence session after this, but some others, including Cosley, will obviously have the opportunity in the next evidence session to say more about their particular view, would like to see less of the principles on the bill in their submission and less of the structure. So you have some partners saying, could we have less of the structures and less of the principles, and they'll have their own reasons for saying that, and yourselves describing it on the other side of the coin saying, well, actually, you could say a little bit more about that, please, to beef it up and calling it a bare bone bill. And that kind of gives me a little bit of assurance maybe the government has steered a kind of middle path in relation to getting the balance right. Now, I know there's not a question in there, but I wonder if there's any comments on that steering the middle path, and I'm not going to come back in for a supplementary on that, because there are any comments in relation to that.
I think at the end of the day, we have to remember that, you know, the bill and the act, okay, it then becomes, you know, the backcloth against which the activity takes place. But in terms of day-to-day relevance, whether at the front line or, you know, more senior levels within organisations, that isn't really what drives day-to-day delivery. So I think one has to, as you say, perhaps steer a middle course without repeating, I do think there are one or two areas where you could be much more proactive in relation to budgets and in relation to the role of housing and other partners.
Other questions, Convener? Thank you.
Okay, Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Just from listening to the evidence you've given so far, it would appear that on the one hand, you're saying that you can't just structurally change an organisation and expect it to deliver. And I think we would accept that there's a huge element of this that is culture. But on the other hand, you're saying, well, we can't legislate for the culture within an organisation. We can't legislate to make people enthusiastic, although it would be good if we could. But do you believe that simply by having a legislative underpinning increases the accountability of those who we are expecting to deliver on this agenda?
Yes, by definition it will, given that there are clear responsibilities about what organisations are expected to do. So,
Just because in the past, a lot of the examples that have been cited around where good work or good intentions have taken place but it has failed to materialise, there has perhaps been that lack of legislative underpinning to what was being done, and it was simply being driven by the power of good intention, whereas what we have here is a bill which I think would mirror the intention to deliver but also has a legislative underpinning behind it. And might that strengthen this approach compared to previous approaches which didn't have that underpinning behind them?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's would be my recollection of. I was seconded into local government. I think 2001, 2002, precisely at the time around Joint Future. And I remember a number of circulars around that point, which were really quite directive, I think, in terms of what the expectation would be in terms of organising protocols and who might have responsibilities. I think, I mean, you might be getting at the experience of what happened in Glasgow in the CHCP is maybe an example of a lack of clarity over responsibility, maybe for decision making between the two organisations. Perhaps there were clearly issues there around that. So I'm not sure I read it the same way in terms of what was expected in terms of accountability last time and this time. I take your point that it's quite clear that there will be accountability, but I'm not sure that was necessarily problematic last time. It may be clearer this time with the idea of the joint officer effectively having a sole responsibility, which was again something that CHCP tried to do.
Okay.
I think you have to avoid having a false confidence that it will necessarily lead to a better solution. I think we have to be cognizant of the experience of Northern Ireland, where, you know, structures did not necessarily deliver what was hoped. So I think we have to, and to some extent, being in the past a researcher, it's almost a researchable question as to whether this will actually deliver better than the less mandated pattern of the future. I think, as I said before, the fact that it has raised the profile may lead one to be optimistic, but I think there has to be the appreciation that it's the hard work on all those other aspects that we've focused on that is required, and it won't in itself create some magic solution.
No, I mean, I wouldn't want to give the impression that I think that simply by legislating you solve some of the problems that have existed, and merely that by increasing accountability you perhaps push that forward a bit quicker. But do we essentially come down to the point that this is about the people within organisations, and are we in a position where in some organisations we have people who are just getting on and driving this forward, and in other organisations we have people who for whatever reason are either unable or unwilling to drive this agenda forward?
I would have thought that was about 80% of the case. And I think the other thing you have to bear in mind is, are there going to be any unintended consequences of the new arrangements that are proposed? You know, what is going to be the impact on, say, children's services in some of the areas, if they don't include that within the total partnership? I think one just has, you know, like any of these developments, there are sort of, you know, some gains and some losses. And I think, again, we have to have the people, the leaders who can navigate that and, in a sense, deliver the solutions regardless of what has been mandated in particular local areas.
I take your point, and again, comes to the COSLA submission, is that they want the legislation to be very tightly written to reflect only the adult section of health and social care, which would limit the ability to expand the model were it to prove successful. But we can touch on that perhaps during the next evidence session. Just on the issue around outcomes and the implication that outcomes can be counterproductive. I think I understand where you're coming from, but presumably the only two things you can measure are the input or the outcomes. And to me, the outcomes are the more important thing, because provided you get the measures right, obviously, that is what is affecting the people at the sharp end. So is it the case that it is simply focusing on outcomes can be counterproductive, or is it just how you select the outcomes that you measure, and that's the important aspect?
I think there's part of the problem generally in public policy in the United Kingdom in the last 15 or 20 years is importing what I would probably call context-free management, particularly into public sector agencies, if we broadly use that phrase for health or social care or whatever. And that these are management processes and output processes which probably work very well within particular organisations, manufacturing motor cars or whatever, but importing ideas wholesale on an outcome basis seems to me to have been problematic. So I'm not per se against the idea of an outcome, but the problem is if you have outcomes, then I think it really can damage some very good, creative, interesting work. Maybe what we need to do is start with the idea of doing something creative and positive with the facts as we see them on the ground, learn from that, learn from the mistakes involved in that. So it may be you're doing the right thing, but you're doing it wrong, and you can learn from that if you're doing it at the local level. If you've got a set of outcomes which people are working towards, and the outcomes actually don't make much sense or basically are transported from some other area, then you're essentially always working on the wrong basis, because you're working to a series of outcomes that possibly aren't reflecting the reality of what's happening on the ground.
I think there's a fundamental clarification that's required here, and where I might disagree with Andrew. I think we have to distinguish between something being driven by the delivery of outcomes for the individual, which I think should be at the heart of this entire process, and perhaps the more traditional sort of outcome-based accounting type approach, which I think is the one that Andrew has questions about. So I think it's this difficulty of words now meaning different things.
Yeah, no, I take on board that point entirely, and I guess the concern I have is that in the past we've often measured the success of things by how much money gets thrown at them rather than what the end result is.
Well, I think in the past you've measured the measurable, and that means that often in the process of doing that you avoid dealing with complexity, and I think a lot of people are engaged in a process. Managers might be well engaged in the process precisely of measuring the measurable, as opposed to really getting to grips with complexity, which is not easily measured sometimes.
Do you think we measure too much?
Personally, certainly coming in the sector I do, yes. Yes, I think we probably do, and I think we probably need to sit back and I think the interesting analysis in this actually doesn't come from the UK, it comes from people in other parts of continental Europe who do quite a lot of work on the British UK public policy. I'd be happy to recommend some interesting studies who look at this and say, why does Britain shape its public policy in this way, when in fact the evidence base for that kind of accounting approach to measuring the measurable is demonstrably problematic, and yet we continue to do it. And I think that's partly actually because it's what people have become very skilled at doing in the last 10 or 15 years, or the last 15 or 20 years, and therefore it's hard to retract from that and think out of the box.
I think perhaps it's epitomised in the distinction between measuring bed occupancy, say, or delayed discharge, and actually measuring the extent to which that individual being discharged from hospital arrived home and had a good experience and wasn't back in hospital 2 days later.
Yeah. Is there not the danger inherent, though, that the minute you say that you are not going to measure X, Y, or Z, that those of a cynical disposition will imply that you're not measuring X, Y, or Z anymore because you can't meet the targets you set for X, Y, or Z, or that you're trying to hide something from the general public? And is that not the danger inherent in perhaps reducing the number of measurements that take place?
Well, maybe that's a cynicism we need to get over.
Okay.
It didn't sound like an endorsement, as was alluded to earlier, about the prescriptive nature of the bill. I mean, you've mentioned and criticised heat targets and outcomes, and you know, that's going to be a serious part of measuring through this bill whether the minister needs to intervene. So you know, it's a serious objective here that measurement is going to be applied to a worrying degree, where it becomes prescriptive, and if you don't reach this target, that target, or the other target, then the minister will have powers to intervene.
From my point of view, I think the proposed outcome measures for health and social care integration at the national level have attempted to actually grapple with getting this more nuanced, sophisticated understanding of targets, that it has tried to introduce, not perfectly by any means, but it has certainly tried to introduce a greater emphasis on outcomes for the individual in a more, not just in terms of where they are, but in terms of how they're experiencing things. And I think that is a significant improvement as far as I'm concerned. I think there have been advances in trying to get more sophisticated measurement, because I absolutely agree with the point that, you know, if you retreat completely, I think it's much more about trying to get an understanding of the reality of these things and what measurement is really about, rather than just taking crude indicators.
Yep, I agree, and I think there has been. I agree also. There's been movement on that actually. So the point I'm really making, I think, is a historical one, like going back to previous attempts and the ways in which outcomes were very, very process driven, and also I think the caution I'm giving here is the fact that we're in quite different places in Scotland. My recollection of having worked with organisations and maybe a decade ago in this, where there was some very interesting and I think very creative local practice, which then very quickly became usurped by the idea of parachuting in people who are going to manage this process of integration. So I think there needs to be a lot of sensitivity about, if things are working reasonably well on the ground, then that has to be allowed to flourish effectively. And all the caution I'm giving about outcome measures, which I think, as Alison says, in some cases entirely useful measures, but often as broadly measuring accounting principles or whatever on that basis of accounting principles, then I think they can be very counterproductive. So for me, one of the issues will be, what are these outcome measures going to actually do? And how far do we take account of the fact that there are areas of Scotland in quite different places in terms of the point at which you might decide to intervene? That seems to me to be a pretty sensitive issue.
Would you agree then that outcomes partly change that culture and environment that people are working in?
It depends on the outcome. If the outcome would be what's good for this individual that we're dealing with, then that may well actually change people. But if the outcome is a broader set of again structural or organisational procedural outcomes, which certainly accompanied what we were doing, I think, 10 years ago, then I think that becomes problematic. I think that often that can become quite counterintuitive.
But not necessarily bad in itself, if the outcomes are defined and supported by the people who are recipients, the people who are delivering. They're not necessarily bad.
As far as I'm concerned, that's key to the whole endeavour. And in fact, if we're talking about you know, how you motivate the workforce, the opportunity for members, particularly frontline workers, to be working with individuals, you know, and again, we're back to the sort of new models of partnership working, not just amongst professionals, but with individuals, seeing the extent to which they can enable individuals to achieve the outcomes they want, to have a better life. That is really what should be at the forefront of all this, and the rest of the sort of panoply of you know, mechanisms and structures falls in behind that. So that for me is still the vision that we have to be trying to achieve, and that is what should be driving, and that is in a sense the cultural change that we've been talking about as well. And I think we mustn't lose that in, you know, in sort of past definitions of sort of outcome-based accounting and so on. As far as I read the sort of legislation, proposed legislation and the memorandums, it does seem to me a lot of that is about making a difference for the individual.
Whether it may be right, proportionate or not, I mean, I think the general principle that everybody agrees that it could be better, and we're all muddling our way to get a situation that gets better delivery. And one of the gaps that maybe to change that culture is that we stop thinking about the army of social workers, the army of medics, etc., who are human beings like us all. We don't like change. Very difficult to organise that in any work setting. Does positive and enforceable rights for those who are in receipt of care address significantly enough here to change that culture? If we were starting at that point,
I think again,
then it influences the outcomes, the targets, etc., because as alluded to earlier with Rhoda Grant, what we deal with is that actual assessment on that individual, whether they're placed, as Bob said, whether it's a 15-minute visit, whether it is of quality, etc. And maybe it's at that point we should be enforceable rights for those people in receipt of care that would change the culture.
I mean, I think, and I know there's a very strong movement to have a real human rights sort of approach and focus to this, which I absolutely would endorse. But I think we, again, just introducing it won't change things overnight. I think we have to see this as a long evolution. You know, and we are, over the last 30, 40 years, we've moved in the right direction. There are things that happened 20 years ago when people are still living in long-stay hospitals that we would throw up our hands in horror at the moment. We've got self-directed support in place. We're starting to see some really heartening changes and improvements. So absolutely, if putting some of those words and, if sort of endorsing those sorts of approaches can accelerate that move along that continuum, that's all for the great. But just putting the words in won't make it happen.
Yeah, I think I agree, because we've already got effectively Section 8 of the human rights legislation is about dignity. And so you could immediately make a recourse if there were circumstances in which people were not having dignified health and social care. You could have a recourse on that basis already. So I'm not sure that having that adds to, again, the fundamental point of it is how do we achieve this? How do we actually implement this? So again, having statutes like that may have their uses, again, as motivators or triggers or whatever the case may be, but it's fundamentally not going to alter the most important thing, which is how do we change a culture of ways of working, I think. Because again, as I said, we've got that already. You can have recourse to human rights legislation in terms of dignity.
So the bill before us, do you expect it to be any more successful than the previous bills that tried to address this issue?
That's a big question. I think it's idea of being slightly less prescriptive at the local level about how people might achieve these things is useful. I think the legislation in itself, as it stands, is a shell, effectively, in which a lot has to go into in terms of attitudes, change and leadership. It's all in there. I mean, it talks about leadership, it talks about training. I'd probably like to see a bit more emphasis, again, on the idea of the sheer cultural shift that might be required to make this work.
You just lost your academic status there and slipped into a politician's answer on that one, I think.
Well, in that case, I'll give you an academic answer. I don't know.
Right.
And I suppose I would like to think that both the professional community and, Scotland more widely, communities within Scotland, would build on the fact that there happens to be this bill in order to move forward and continue to move forward on this. I think, again, I'm repeating myself, but I wouldn't necessarily believe that having the bill will overcome areas where there may have been challenges. It's not a magic bullet.
Just one final question. I don't know if there's anyone else, but you know, just in terms of the development of leadership and that vision, those visionaries and things, and indeed there's long, decade-long or more attempts to address this situation, well known. What have the learning institutions done in that decade to bring forward these visionaries or leaders?
I think the learning institutions have provided a very substantial research base on the whole area of integrated working. I think it's all out there effectively. I'm sitting here with a copy of Simon Colkin's stuff he's written on targets in public policy. So we have a lot of material he's written on that. There's been a lot of stuff down on integration. It's been written about. And it does strike me, it's quite interesting actually, in the work I was doing with integration managers in the past, just how people were so tied down or wrapped up in the day-to-day business of getting through the day-to-day that there wasn't that space. And I would say, well, actually, this has been written about. Precisely this area you're talking about has already been written about. You should maybe have a copy of this, have a look at it, whatever. So I think it's there, and I think it needs to be accessed. And part of that is it has always struck me in working with frontline managers in particular that they're under a lot of pressure and there's not very much space to be able to develop that. At the moment, for example, I'm teaching social work managers, and that is a very powerful protected space of 1 day a week effectively in which we can start to explore this, and a lot of this stuff is new, you know, and it's been out there for a while, so I think it's there.
Just a final anecdote from me. I used to be involved in a postgrad course at Glasgow University which brought together managers from a whole range of different backgrounds and indeed statutory independent agencies. And they came in 1 day a week over a couple of years. And the learning together was an incredibly powerful experience for them. It wasn't so much what they heard from us. I very much remember one day someone who was a sort of health board planner, as it were, talking about, you know, dreadful difficulties when, you know, people didn't empty beds and that sort of thing. And someone from the social work profession was talking about, well, you know, imagine that was your grandmother or whatever. Would you want them shifted overnight? And it was that interdisciplinary learning, which I think if we could make space for, finance for, because I gather that is a real issue, I think that is a very powerful experience.
No further questions? Can I thank you both for your time and your evidence this morning. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. Thank you. Suspend at this point while we set up for the No, you'll not need to. They'll. We now move to our round table session with people from local government. As we normally do in round table sessions, rather than me introducing everyone, we just go around the table and ask each of you to introduce yourself as well as the committee members. Duncan.
Duncan Mackay, I'm Head of Social Work Development in North Lanarkshire Council.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Good morning, Suman Singh Gupta, Head of Strategy, Planning and Health Improvement for Western Bartonshire Community Health and Care Partnership.
Lynette Milne, MSP for North East Scotland.
Peter Gavitas, Director of Health and Social Care for Edinburgh.
Gil Patterson, MSP for Claybank and Mulgai.
Suzanne Harrison, Integration Programme Manager in Edinburgh.
Rhoda Grant, MSP for the Highlands and Islands.
Aileen MacLeod, MSP for South of Scotland.
I'm Richie Johnson, Director of Housing and Social Work with Aberdeenshire Council.
Malcolm Chisholm, MSP for Edinburgh, Northern and Leith.
Ron Cully, Chief Officer Health and Social Care for COSLA.
Richard Lyle, MSP Central Region.
Good morning, Councillor Peter Johnson. I'm the COSLA Health and Wellbeing spokesperson.
Mark MacDonald, MSP for Aberdeen Donside.
And Duncan McNeill, MSP for Greater Inverclyde and Convener of the Committee. Bob, I think you're going to just open us up a wee bit here.
Yeah, just I suppose a general question. Obviously, some local authorities are further down the road to health and social care integration, and the bill before us will put the requirement to do that on a statutory basis. So I'm quite keen to hear from any of our witnesses who think they've already travelled quite far down the road of health and social care integration, and how the bill actually kind of, I feel like, dovetails with what they might be already doing.
Any takers on that? Suman?
Thank you. I think that was an invitation to me. Certainly from my perspective, I mean, I'm not here to kind of talk to other areas, particularly local, other councils, about how they need to take forward their business, and particularly in respect to local democratic processes. But what I can say in terms of Western Bartonshire is that certainly the Council and the Health Board have had a long track record of doing a lot of joint work over time. So when we got to the point in October 2010 of deciding, of effectively enacting the Community Health and Care Partnership, there was a history of fairly substantial joint working at all levels, particularly at a frontline level, so it felt comfortable and right. That's not to say that there weren't a lot of questions that staff had and concerns that had to be worked through, and some quite challenging issues people need to think about in terms of territory, for example. But we had a really strong basis, so effectively the partners involved were keen to do it. Since then, we, in common with a number of other areas, kind of East Renfrewshire, have been involved in this kind of work for much longer. Structurally, Inverclyde, in terms of the convener's own area, is fairly well progressed now. I think for us, we're probably in a position where the bill in itself won't have substantive difference in terms of how we'll do the day job. The day after it's enacted, the world, in terms of operational services, will pretty much be the same as the day it was beforehand. It does raise up interesting opportunities in terms of accountability, and something we're very keen, and we've mentioned within our submission, in trying to streamline accountabilities, certainly within the public sector arena that we all now work in, for all the opportunities that partnership working provide, and the nature of the wicked issues we're trying to tackle, you can find yourself in a situation where you're trying to report to multiple different stakeholders at different times. And certainly, from our perspective, being quite clear of who you're accountable for what, and a shared set of outcomes that relate to the spectrum of the health and social care agenda will be very powerful, because it provides a clarity. It provides a clarity of purpose for the organisation, provide a clarity of purpose for the staff, a clarity of expectations we would hope for our local community, and I think also a clarity of fairness in terms of what MSPs like yourselves and other elected officials should be expecting from the organisations and the leadership of those organisations. One of the points I noted from the previous evidence section was around managing ambition here. This is an ambitious step for us in terms of Scotland, but we shouldn't get overexcited about effectively what a structural change will do, or indeed the other changes within the bill. That's only part of the solution. there's a lot more work to get done. And I'm sure in all the areas, even the areas which aren't necessarily as structurally integrated as we are, they will also be doing similar types of innovative work on the ground. There will be lots of joint working between staff, and they will all have examples. We will all have examples of really good practice that we can bring to the table.
Have any other panel? Good, Duncan, you come in. Panel members, please, come in. Duncan.
Thank you, Convener. I would just like to caution committee that there are partnerships who may appear to be more integrated than others, but those with integrated structures may not in practice on the ground be necessarily more integrated than those that don't have the same structures. And those partnerships that do may or may not be achieving better outcomes than those that don't appear to have the level of structural integration that some partnerships in Scotland do. And if I may take the opportunity to illustrate that, in North Lanarkshire we've been working towards integration in many ways over many years and have a suite of integrated services such as integrated day services for older people, integrated equipment adaptations teams, integrated addiction teams, and so on. And in fact, those services have, and the general partnership approach have been consistently well evaluated by external inspections and recognised as recently as 2011 by the Nuffield Trust as one of 4 worldwide exemplars of integrated working. So it doesn't necessarily follow that the structure that any one partnership, and there'll be inevitably 32 variations across Scotland, it doesn't necessarily follow that those arrangements lead to better outcomes for individuals. And I've just cautioned the committee that there's, as you've heard in the previous evidence, that there can be a somewhat tenuous nature, a tenuous connection between a structure and the intended outcomes.
Yes, Peter.
Can I say what, in answering your question, put into context what I'd like to say firstly? I think from a causal perspective, we would say that the integration in social care is the cornerstone of public sector reform. We very much support the direction of travel. We recognise that an approach that is outcomes-based, that uses resources flexibly, promotes co-production, early intervention and prevention, and facilitates service integration is the way ahead. And you're absolutely right, Mr Doris, in saying that we start from a basis where some local authorities and the NHS partners are way down this line. Those of you who know me will know I'm from West Lothian Council, where West Lothian is one of the leading councils in this respect. Likewise, in Highland, they've taken a different model with a lead agency approach. And there are other councils, as our colleague Duncan Mackay has said, who've developed a different way. But that experience of all people starting from different starting points has led Cosworth to strongly take the view that in some parts this bill is too prescriptive, and particularly with regards to the scope of the bill. And we would argue strongly that, as we've said in our submission, that the starting place for all partnerships should be adult social services, and that within the bill there should be local flexibility to evolve and develop the integration, not on the basis of structures or something imposed by ministers, but by local flexibility and local knowledge and local leadership. Because we've heard earlier that it's not structures that change this, it's local leadership, local cultures developing, and we think that's fundamental to the success of this project in further integrating health and social care.
I'd like to agree with my colleague from North Lanarkshire in a way. I hesitated to come in when the first question asked about, where do you think you are in terms of progress? Because if we looked at what's in the bill, then Edinburgh would seem to be very far forward in relation to integration. I've been the joint director for 8 years. My colleague in West Lothian had a joint director in a similar time period. More recently, Eastern Mid Lothian, coterminous with NHS Lothian, have also appointed joint directors. So we have joint directors in place. At the end of this month, we'll have completed a whole year as a shadow health and social care partnership So in terms of the bill and what the bill is signalling as a direction of travel, then we'd be very far forward. And yet I myself still feel we've got an awful long way to go on integration. And I think there are examples across the country of really well integrated services, and even those who in structural terms appear to be fairly well advanced, the position is very mixed. And I think what really counts is not so much the governance arrangements are important, but what I'm really interested in and passionate about is, are we making a real difference to the lives of the people that we serve? Are we making our services more seamless? Are the people who we serve able to see the cracks between the statutory services? Those are the things that I'm really passionate about.
Jay?
Yep, thank you, Convener. Again, I'd agree with both Duncan and Peter's comments as well there. In Aberdeenshire, again, just to give an illustration, we don't have the same formal structural integration that has been described in Edinburgh, for example. And I think, like many other councils, we could point to a lot of good joint working practices, good joint working teams, particularly in a rural area where that's essential in terms of getting that rurality reflected. But there is a whole lot of work that we are doing still around this. And while we would say that the bill itself, the legislation may not have been ultimately required to move us on, nonetheless it's there. And from our perspective, we want to push that on. So as well as some of the structural elements to it, which are inevitable, it's even more important to backfill, to support that with a whole series of initiatives on leadership and communication, on culture, as you've heard this morning already. So it's not one approach, it's a series of things we need to do to make this actually work and make a real difference. And the question that I keep challenging my team and my colleagues around are about, why are we doing this? This must make a difference to the people that receive our services. And if that's not what this is about, then we're missing something. I'm not saying anybody's suggesting it isn't what it's about, but I think we need to keep coming back to that question. Otherwise, we can get drawn into quite a lengthy debate about structures and principles that, while maybe interesting and have some importance, are not the key tenet of this whole agenda. So it's keeping that focus on why are we doing this, and challenging our teams on that basis regularly.
Other panel members? I suppose the question asks, if everything's going along swimmingly, why do we need the legislation? Ron Colley.
Yeah, I suppose there's a number of ways you could come at that question. I mean, in one sense, legislation is an admission of failure, that we haven't been able to do something of our own volition, or that there are other barriers that need to be overcome. In some respects, what you've heard from the colleagues already today is that there's a lot of good work happening locally that's knitting together practice between social work and health, and that will continue irrespective of the bill. What the bill can do, though, is to address some barriers in respect of the way in which the health service works with local government. What I'm thinking specifically of is in relation to integrated resources and the extent to which we can start to plan with a total resource for an entire population. And in particular, the way in which we can integrate the acute sector into that environment. Because that, after all, I think has probably been the biggest failure of the last decade. The non-integration of acute care, not just with social work, but with primary care. Acute has sat on its own. And I think one of the fundamental strengths of the integration agenda advanced by the government is that it's not prepared to see that any longer. The reality is that as we move forward in demanding circumstances financially, where there is going to be probably a flat cash situation for the next few years, we need to be smarter about how we use our total resource. And historically, we've probably invested too much in secondary care at the expense of both social care and primary care. So if this bill allows us to become more imaginative about how we use our total resource, and if we can over time begin to deploy our collective resources more effectively, then that will be a success and that will justify the legislation. But there's a number of big caveats in there in terms of our capacity to do that.
There are a few reasons for me that stand out as to why the legislation is important and necessary. There's some specific things, like in terms of governance, the 1973 Local Government Act as it's been described to me by the lawyers within the council, suggests that any committee formed by the council has to have 2/3 of elected members to 1/3 of the alternatives. Now, different councils have interpreted that differently, but my own council solicitors are quite clear about that. That immediately, if you create that and you try to establish a partnership body, you can't do that if one of those two organisations has 2/3 of the votes on it. It's not an equitable distribution, so there's a governance issue around that. There's also issues around assets and different accounting regimes, and it's not so much within the legislation, but the regulations that will follow that will address that in due course. There are issues about the budgets, which again will be addressed by regulation, and the work that's been done on the back of the legislation that require it. So I think it's required for a number of reasons, but probably the biggest one for me is community health partnerships. If we look at what they were asked to do, one of their responsibilities, if we go back to that legislation, was around commissioning and influencing acute services. And community health partnerships were not established in a way that actually effectively allowed us to do that. I think the way that health and social care partnerships have been positioned and the responsibilities and the power that's given to the health and social care partnerships has the potential to fundamentally change that relationship and the power balance between primary and social care and the acute sector, and to actually make that a much more equitable relationship than it ever was in community health partnerships. So I think it's really important from all of those perspectives.
Anyone else? Malcolm, did you want to come in on some of that?
I think there's a kind of continuity between the opening comments and the previous panel. We're all agreed that structural change isn't going to deliver what we want, but we're probably going to end up talking about that a lot because a lot of the concerns of local authorities are around that particular area. And I suppose I'm interested in what people like in the bill and what they don't like in the bill. And I suppose it's really a question for Peter in a kind of way, because I was struck by the City of Edinburgh Council submission. Obviously, he said some things that he likes about the bill, but the City of Edinburgh Council is also pointing, and I don't know whether this is true or not, it's an open question, but they're saying there's a gap between the original proposals and what's in the bill, and they have some concerns around the position of the corporate bodies and the chief officer. So that might seem to be right into structures and technicalities, but it does seem to be a very important point, and I was wondering if Peter could explain that and whether any of the other councils have a similar concern about that, because I think we all get the message that the local authorities don't like the degree of prescription in the bill when it comes to local authorities, but I'm interested in any other concerns that they have, and that was certainly one that I picked out from the Edinburgh submission.
When we did the introductions around the table and you introduced people to begin with in this session, you described it as a session from local government, people here from local government, hence Cosler and Councillor Johnson. I'm actually from the NHS and local government because I'm already jointly accountable officer, and I see this through the lens of both the NHS and the council. And what we put in front of you was an NHS Lothian submission, to which there are issues and concerns, which I'll happily summarise. And also what I put in front of you was the corporate response from the council that took into account all the departments within the council. So people in corporate governance, in legal, in housing, in all sorts of other areas of the council. And it is a composite reflection of the corporate concerns. I've got a kind of more narrow view as the Director of Health and Social Care, but the kind of concerns that are in there about how the legislation are drafted at present, to try and summarise. First of all, there's issues about scope, which were touched upon in that first discussion. It's not particularly prescriptive about acute services. That may well follow in the regulations, but I think there does need to be some, at least a minimum requirement around acute services. My colleagues in the NHS, I think, are more hesitant about that. And I think they're right to be concerned about that, but colleagues in local government would like to see it be more specific around what acute services should be in. The main concern from the NHS is about the body corporate. and what legal status it has and what relationship it has with the parent body. And at times, the bill is a bit confusing about, I think a bit confusing and unclear about the relationship with a parent body. And I think it's doing that because it's trying to empower and give a status to the Health and Social Care Partnership. But in doing so, it doesn't make it clear what its relationship is with the parent body. And as a consequence, both parent bodies in NHS Lothian are concerned about that. There are some things that it doesn't require the parent's body approval for. So the plan that it's responsible for, it doesn't actually say in the legislation that it actually has to have that plan signed off by the two parent bodies. You can kind of assume that that's what might well be required implicitly, but explicitly, it doesn't say that. It also, in relation to that, doesn't say that the parent bodies are to appoint the jointly accountable officer. The way it's written, it implies that the Health and Social Care Partnership is established and then it goes out and appoints the jointly accountable officer. And clearly the two parent bodies, in my case NHS Lothian and City of Edinburgh Council, it's kind of academic in a way because they've already got one and it's me, but it's more the principle of that and what that's saying about the power balance between the parent bodies and the organisation. In terms of delegation, it's not clear if the parent bodies retain ultimate responsibility. One of the tests for me would be if in the Health and Social Care Partnership we did something really awful to a patient, if we use that as an example, who's actually legally accountable for that? Is it the Health and Social Care Partnership, or in some way is it the two parent bodies, or is it all three? And I don't think that is terribly clear from the legislation. There's also, more specifically from the NHS, in terms of that power and authority, the legislation says that ministers may appoint to the integration board directly, and there's a concern about that power to do that, because the legislation or the memorandum implies that it's actually the two parent bodies who are appointing to it, whereas the legislation says the ministers may appoint to the integration board, which implies that at some stage down the line, the minister could just arbitrarily decide to appoint people who are not members of the health board or not members of the local authority. Now, I'm sure that's not the intention, but the way it's written, it gives the minister that power at present. I think that's a fair summary, actually, of the issues. Well, it's a summary. I don't know if it's fair.
Was
For you to
Malcolm
judge.
alluding to the original consultation, and because I think in some of the submissions, the consultation with the government, there seems to be, the claim was that there's been a departure from that. Was that the point?
Some people are saying, I just don't have a view on that.
Ron, can you address that aspect?
Yes, I don't think there's been a departure in terms of the policy intent, but there's a very clear departure in terms of what the bill allows. And that's why we are fundamentally concerned about the current articulation of the integration project through the bill as it's written, particularly in respect of scope. All local government functions are in scope with this bill. So if through regulation a Scottish minister wanted to put any local government function, not just social care, education, housing, whatever function of local government he or she wanted to put in, that's possible under this bill. And we are fundamentally opposed to that. We think that there has to be a bill which represents the policy intention, and this bill doesn't do that. So that's why we have been very strong in advocating an amendment which would see a much tighter definition of the local government functions that must, may or may not be delegated. The policy intention is all about adult social care, so what we want is a bill that does that. That's the fundamental part of our concern. Peter went on to talk about many other areas where the bill offers up powers to ministers, and again, we feel concerned about that. There are two axes, actually, that you can look at this. One is the relationship between the NHS and local government, and we were comfortable in that discussion, and we wanted to see reform advanced. But the other axis is the central local dimension. And we think that far too much power has been taken to the centre with this bill, and that we want to see partnerships given more authority and responsibility to get on with the job. It's not an objection to legislation, but it's an objection to the way that the bill has been framed.
Okay, I've got a number, but I just want to test the panel. Anyone else want to come in on that? Gil, followed by Mark.
Just on legislation, that was just follows on what I want to raise. I mean, I always try and take myself into a context that I'm really comfortable with, and that's the business community. And if customers were saying at the sharp end that something needed to be changed, and the representative said something needs to be changed, and the middle management and the upper management said something needs to be changed, then what are the directors going to do about it? So in this regard, I'm just wondering, there's a term that legislation is a hammer to crack a nut, whereas, other opinion is it's a hammer to knock down a door, a barrier to achieve the ends that everyone's crying out for. I haven't actually heard a single person in the evidence that we've heard saying that there is a need for change and there's a need for integration to take place. So is the only way for this to take place? Because let's be fair about it, let's not kid ourselves that there's been, some people are saying here everybody's moving ahead at the present time. So why all of a sudden is everybody moving ahead? Why is it taking so long? If it's such a good idea, everybody thinks it's needed, is the only way to make it happen through legislation.
Panel member on that? Suman?
I'll try to give some part of an answer to that one, but I suspect other colleagues will be able to kind of chip in on this to flesh it out. Across certainly most mining in Western Europe and other countries, health and social care integration has been really talked about almost like the mother lode in terms of a solution to a whole range of problems over many years. I think all of us around the table are quite clear that it's not the magic bullet or the panacea, and I think that's came across to you from already. But nonetheless, it's something that's talked about as something that if you could create, if you could structure, if you get your public sector working that way, it would be a good thing. And certainly in my thinking around this in our work, and I apply the same question, indeed my colleagues do, that Peter's very eloquently talked about in terms of, what does this mean for the end user? How does it make it better for them in the way that Richie's talked about as well? So it's not just about the acute side, although that is a big issue that we need to be looking at. It's as much about, for example, home care and district nursing. What are the opportunities there for those staff going in and providing seamless care to the same sets of clients, patients, etc., so they're not seeing multiple staff going in and that we're making best use of the resources. That, for me, is the kind of strategic commissioning decisions that we can talk about, that Ron talked about earlier. So there's a whole range of enabling elements within the legislation that strikes me that it's about encouraging that. One thing that we've also talked about, and I think Peter very elegantly covered, is effectively some of the undercooked aspects of the legislation, the bits where it just seems to haven't quite got its head around the ambition of what it's talking about here. And that strikes me as really being down to the fact that at the heart of it, what we're talking about is creating an instrument that allows joint commissioning, seriously commissioning, in fact no longer joint, just commissioning, between two different types of public sector bodies, NHS Health Board, Territorial Health Boards and local authorities, which are set up to operate in different ways, with different accountabilities, different sets of scopes. Ron's point from earlier on. We know within local government that local authorities organise their services and function in a whole range of ways. So the social work and education, social work and housing, sometimes together, sometimes apart. And yet we kind of get a little bit hung up on trying to create that kind of connectivity with another body, a public sector body. And I think it's because of the kind of issues that Peter's talked about. And so the bill's trying to do something that I think is very noble and very progressive. However, I think it gets a bit unstuck when it then says, well, how do you do that? What are the kind of governance issues? What are the kind of accountability issues? And to some extent, the way it compensates for that is providing too much detail on, for example, how do you come up with an integration plan? So there's far too much detail from our perspective in terms of how that needs to be put together, which seems to be very bureaucratic and procedural, and yet not quite got its head around some of the macro structural elements here.
Anyone else? Richie?
I think in terms of the question, the challenge around why you need legislation if everything's going swimmingly, I said in my earlier remarks that our council's position was we didn't favour legislation, but that wasn't to say we didn't recognise that we needed to do more collectively with our health colleagues and other partners for that matter. So it is recognising that we can do more. I guess it is just trying to unpick how do we get to this better set of integrated services. We've deliberately started talking about integrated service delivery rather than just integration as shorthand. But sometimes integration can imply structural discussions, and we don't want to focus too heavily on that. It's integrated service delivery is what we can keep coming back to. And when we've taken this through our councillors, through our stakeholders, through our staff, there are a series of layers of issues that we are looking at this. There's the macro element that we've reflected here today about national government, central government and local government. There's regional issues about, for example, NHS Grampian with the 3 local authorities in Grampian. There's the CHB level issues, there's council issues, there's service issues, there's locality issues, and all these need to be pulled together in a coherent kind of way if we're going to really push this agenda forward. And I think most people would say they're up for that, and I think that's absolutely right. But it is understanding that the landscape is a fairly complex one. The business about governance, just to pursue Peter's reference to the body corporate and the chief officer and their actual responsibility, again, is one that we haven't quite got our heads around fully yet either, I would say. We're very close in Aberdeenshire to confirming our position about the model, the scope and how to take this forward. But nonetheless, we recognise that there are some details about how this will actually work that we want to bottom out. And Peter's example about what if something goes wrong, or I think scenario planning or scenario setting might be a helpful tool to say, well, what if, let's create a circumstance and say, in this circumstance, how would the body corporate work? What would the actual responsibility of the chief officer be versus potentially a director of housing and social work, or the council, or the chief executive? It's teasing out those kind of relationships and understanding who ultimately makes that decision and how does that work, and have we got the balance right in terms of empowering the local partnership versus the democratic accountability that some members will wish to retain.
Any other panel member on that one? Yes, Duncan.
It's an interesting dilemma, I think, for parliamentarians, this whole issue, because many of the things what I think we're hearing is widespread support for the policy aspirations of integration. But at the same time, we have a piece of legislation that I think I'm right in saying doesn't actually mention adult social care at any point. So when trying to legislate in this area of activity, there is a dilemma, and I think that dilemma is that many of the aspirations can be achieved without legislation, but equally, many of the aspirations may not be achieved with legislation. And it's how, from an officer perspective in a local authority, how you pick your way, how you navigate your way through some of the ambiguities in the legislation as it's currently framed, and the aspirations to achieve the best possible outcomes for the citizens we serve. And I think that we've touched briefly, colleagues have touched briefly on the acute issue. And my understanding is that it is a ministerial intention that significant elements of the acute sector need to be part of these integration arrangements to work. And certainly the policy memorandum to the bill is very explicit that it sees 2 disconnects, and one of those disconnects is that between acute and primary care. But as it stands, the bill doesn't actually then go on to address that. And I know there's been a national working group looking at that. I know that there will be views that perhaps differ from some amongst this panel from NHS chief executives. But from an operational perspective, that, I think, is absolutely fundamental to whether or not the aspirations of the policy will be realised. If in an authority like my own in North Lanarkshire, you have 3 acute general hospitals, but we're also, because of the geographical location of the authority, we have people admitted to and discharged from 7 hospitals in 4 different health board areas. Integration won't help us manage those complexities. But if it would help us if the part of these required arrangements recognise that people's experience is so contingent on the acute sector working well, and in building strong filters that may prevent people coming into acute hospital environment when they don't need it. And if the bill ultimately or doesn't actually facilitate that, then I fear it won't achieve the aspirations that we all share.
Mark?
It's just on the issue around the ministerial power, and I can understand the perspective from which the concerns are being raised. However, there is a flip side to that as well, which is that if you define too narrowly into a specific element of social care function, that if, well, I say if, but when this is rolled out and proves to be successful, if there is a desire to then roll it out to, say, include, for example, children's services. If the bill is so tightly defined as to only refer to adult social care, adult health and social care, we would then find ourselves around this table again discussing a piece of primary legislation to enable children's services to then be included. And to me, that seems like, to quote a phrase, taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. If it works, then rolling it out. So I guess the question would be, is there a way that you could have a bill that has that expansive element to it, but also retains a focus that would, I suppose, assuage some of the concerns that local government have. The second element to that is that I take entirely the point about wanting this to develop organically at a local level. But do we also then not run the risk of finding ourselves in the same position we found ourselves at the outset of this process, where we were sat around a table discussing why local authority and Health Board A were pressing ahead with this agenda, but local authority and Health Board B were not? Do we run the risk of finding ourselves that those who will press ahead with this will do so, but there are some who need a bit of a legislative kick up the bum, essentially?
Ron?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a few things. To be clear about the COSLA position, we are in favour of local partnerships being able to secure additional service areas coming into the integrated partnership. There are too many of our councils just now who already have integrated children's services within their arrangements. Our objection isn't to that type of expansion, which is done within the context of local circumstances. Our objection is to the potential of a Scottish minister saying, we are requiring you to integrate children's services. And the reason that we object to that is it was never part of the discussion. It was never part of the discussion that we had with the Scottish Government over the last 2 years in advance of this legislation, and it is not part of the policy memorandum. The policy memorandum is very clear that this is a focus on adult social care and health services. So the opportunity that you speak of, we welcome, absolutely, but we just do not want the minister or any future minister to have a potential to force people down this line when that wasn't consulted on and is not part of the policy memorandum. Just in terms of the local arrangements, I think we're comfortable with the legislative framework guiding activity over the next period. But what we want is an enabling legislative framework where local partnerships are empowered to use that total resource imaginatively. So we think that there are benefits to the legislation, but a directive approach I don't think is going to work. What we want to do is invest our time and energy in this commissioning agenda. We want to make local partnerships the bedrock of that commissioning agenda to ensure that we can use this resource differently in a very difficult financial context. The way we get there is to write legislation which is enabling. So it's not about taking powers to the centre. It's actually the opposite. It's about giving powers to localities to say, that's your total resource. Use that imaginatively in order to meet the outcomes of your local population. And that's how we'll get success.
Sir. I think Mark has very clearly hit on a very live and difficult issue. And I was glad to hear that he recognised the importance of these things developing, in his words, organically. And the bill is interesting because when it talks about, for example, the integration plan, it requires the integration plan to be underpinned by substantial locality involvement and consultation. And that in itself makes it absolutely clear that this is bottom up. It's local community up that's going to drive this. And again, I'm here wearing my Causeway hat, not my West Lothian Council hat, where we have an integrated service that has children's services as part of that. But I have to emphasise again that the integrated model in West Lothian evolved over time and by people building up relationships and working together. And I think that's the only way that you're going to do this. Imposing a structure centrally is not going to work. In fact, it will hinder genuine change, genuine cultural change, and the ability to integrate services locally and deliver joined-up services, which is what we all want to see. So that's, I think, where Causeway are coming from, that we want the flexibility to allow local communities working in partnership to shape the future.
Any other panel member? Bob, you want to just continue this?
Very briefly on that, I suppose. I think Mark MacDonald's quite right to tease out a bit more of the dynamics between the scope of the bill and the policy intention. I'm sure the committee will reflect on that. But ultimately, I think the expression by Mr Cully was used by Mr Johnson, that it was to be enabling legislation. I have to say that this has been enabled for a long time. Some places just haven't done it. And Mr Johnson did quite rightly say that the bill is structured in such a way where the requirements on local authorities and health board partners is a bottom-up approach with huge consultation at a local level and that kind of dynamic. The whole point of the legislation, I suppose, is that if there isn't change at a local level at some point, there has to be direction, or there's no point in having the legislation. Because if ultimately we pass a bill that says, here's what we'd like you to do, and then if you don't do any of it, the minister can't step in, kind of what's the point in passing the bill? So I would maybe refer you to, I think it's section 39, where I think a lot of the issues may emerge, which is default powers of Scottish ministers. And it would just be to ask the question that if local authorities and health board partners can, and I think they will, incidentally, I think this is a power that will hopefully never ever have to be used, but if local authorities and health board partners can't get around the table, can't agree a plan, surely to goodness at some point Scottish ministers should have the power to step in and make it happen. So we can maybe have a debate about whether or not, just, I don't finish off.
Get a response,
but
because I've got 4 waiting,
yeah, okay.
and you know, your colleagues are as well. I mean, I think you've made the point quite well, and we can get a response. Ron, you first up. Yeah.
That's something we disagree with, because what you're saying there is, should Scottish ministers have the capacity to ensure that the legislation is followed? Of course they should, absolutely. That's not what we're disagreeing with. What we're disagreeing with is the way in which the policy intention has been articulated in the bill, and we think there's a drift. And we think that that's something that we want to work with government, we want to work with the Parliament to ensure that we can correct.
Anyone else on that? Is there a clash of two cultures here? Because we've got the 32 local authorities, and we've got more centralised setup with the health and through the minister. Is there a drift here because of that? Is there a, I can't even find any, I don't mean to say a conflict of interest, but the Cabinet Secretary's interest is about defending his Cabinet's budget, and he's more, I suppose, susceptible on a daily basis to being lobbied and, you know, hearing those anxieties from the acute sector, because so many of us chase after that as politicians, but a lot of pressure on the Cabinet Secretary to deliver there. Does any of this drift come about, do you think, through some of that? Or?
Well, the NHS is a managed service, local government is a democratic institution in a different way, so I think that's an observation that probably holds some weight. Ultimately, though, what we are asking for is just to make sure that this bill does what it says in the tin, because you know that's where the amendments we would like to bring forward, or to have others bring them forward, would produce a bill which we are more comfortable with, which is more empowering, which is less directive, which is less prescriptive in parts. You know, the use of authority at a national level is clearly going to be important to underpin any legislation. We absolutely accept that. it's where you start to introduce discretionary powers, which gives us very serious concern. And we do not think that it's necessary. We absolutely do not think that it's necessary. There has to be a legislative framework that we can all work within, but then allow partnerships to get on with the job. That's what we're asking for.
Rhoda Grant.
The discussion's moved on, but I think we're getting maybe close to the nub of the issue about having a bill to facilitate joint working rather than to dictate how it happens. Then I suppose that kind of takes us back to the aim of the bill. And I suppose if you look at kind of a step back for a moment, we've been talking about things like, shifting the balance of care from the acute sector to primary and indeed home care. And if we're going to do more of that, there is a huge amount we can do using telemedicine and the like, where home carers could help facilitate that, so that there could be the opportunity to really shift the balance. But how do we do that? I mean, some of the authorities around here have obviously had an awful lot of work and have been pushing that forward. And there's probably things that maybe you feel that should be in the bill that are blocks to that happening currently that we need to look at. But how do we then take along with that move and change those that are more reticent? Maybe there's not good working relationships on the ground. How do government who are looking at this then ensure that the same standard of care is available to Joe Bloggs, regardless of which local authority or indeed health board area that they're in?
Peter and then Suman.
Just specifically on that last point, my chief exec in health made me jointly accountable with a director of nursing services for unscheduled care, emergency care. She manages the acute component of that, and I manage the primary and social care and community health component of that. Just an example of one of the things we're doing in terms of shifting that balance. We're about to introduce step-down beds, which I know a lot of authorities have been doing as well. I think the thing that's probably quite different about Lothian, or might well be quite different about Lothian, is that the funding for that is actually coming from the acute sector. We've done the detailed calculations that says we can actually manage with less acute beds if we have the step-down facility and if we have the correct flow through the step-down facility. So in social care, we're commissioning that. It's partly been commissioned by the private sector and it's partly been provided internally, but the funding for it is ultimately coming from the acute sector. Now, all of that is happening without legislation. We're just doing that anyway.
Truman?
I'm just going to kind of effectively pick up on a variation of that, which is part of the way you address it, is by having a smaller number of individuals who are accountable for the totality of that work. So in the way that Peter's talked about there, effectively you have two extremely senior managers who are responsible for the totality of that activity, and rather than it being 3 or 4 or 5. So again, within our neck of the woods, if there was on a much more local level, if there's somebody got an issue around like a residential care and someone's got an issue about the district nursing input, it'll be the same head of service, let alone the same director, who's got accountability for that, can be contacted about that, can also is empowered to deal with that because they've got responsibility for the same budget, albeit at the moment they're not pool budgets, they're aligned budgets. It provides a facility whereby rather than it being 20 people to deal with an issue, you get it down to, in the case of the director, the single officer, 1, and their team. So that should create synergies and efficiencies in driving through change. But by the same token, it then requires a managed solutions, what everyone's talked about here, that these are wicked issues. I mean, I think that was something that's come through repeatedly, I think, from all our submissions, is that this is how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. So this is an important bite, but it's only one part of it, and there's lots of other things that have to go in at the same time.
Ron?
The debate about shifting the balance of care is absolutely pivotal to this, and that's one of the reasons that we've come in so hard in favour of the introduction of acute budgets to the integrated resource, because actually without that it's going to be difficult, we think anyway, to redesign services. But I also wanted to make a slightly wider point, which is that across both the NHS and local government, and indeed into the third sector and private sectors, there's a fairly widely shared view now that into the future that there's just not going to be enough money to cope with the changing structure of our population, increasing levels of demand. And yes, we can invest in prevention and we can reconfigure the way in which we provide services, and all of that will help, but it will never eliminate the basic problem which we need to address in time. Now, that's not necessarily something that can be solved through this bill, but it is something that we would want the Parliament to be aware of, that over the next decade we need a solution to this, which isn't just going to be about how do we optimise the provision of care. It has to be a fundamental discussion about our expectations as a society and what we think the relationship between the citizen and the state should be into the future and how we pay for our care. So let's not lose sight of that as we move forward over the next period.
I heard, half an hour ago that cultural change, the change that's necessary, can take a decade, 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, how do we square that with what you've just said?
Well, we've always said you need both. We need to both change the way in which we deliver services, and that's why we're in favour of integration, to ensure that there's closer working between the NHS and local government and our partners in the third sector and the private sector. But that's a necessary, it's not a sufficient guarantee of change, and what we need to go alongside that is a more fundamental debate about how we actually fund care into the future, because it's just not sustainable.
Back into Bob's point, that the imperative was there for the last 10 years, but the pace didn't match the necessity to go forward.
And we accept that half of the argument. We accept that there is an opportunity with the legislation to achieve a step change. I think that's fine. But there's another half of the argument which isn't being heard, which has been buried, which is that there's not enough money in the pot going forward, straightforwardly.
Anyone else on that? I'm going to take the panel members first, and I've got a couple of people waiting as well. Duncan?
Peter? I think it's important that the committee do actually recognise that in terms of reshaping care and the balance of care older people, there are a significantly lower proportion of older people in care homes now in Scotland than there were 10 years ago. But, and some authorities have performed, some partnerships have performed very successfully in reducing that to substantially lower levels. Through actually, in direct response to Rhoda Grant's question, through commissioning a series of either very intensive alternatives or both very intensive alternatives and preventive measures. So that's where we, I think, have reached in those partnerships that have pushed that level down to perhaps 25 older people per 1,000 in a care home. Scottish average is 35. Is that there are some areas of activity that are beyond our influence. And those areas of activity generally lie not in primary care, because there's often good, strong partnership working between primary care and community social work services, but within the acute sector. And if that merits further analysis in the context of this legislation, and if you look at the routes by which people arrive at an acute hospital, there are typically four. One is that they arrive at the door, and that begs the question of, have they arrived at the door, as one report put it, because the lights were on? Could they have had better access to a GP? Could they have had better access to other forms of support and advice and treatment that would have prevented that? The second route is through GPs, which is who are self-employed contractors, as the committee knows, under the terms of a national contract, over which there is limited local influence, and none at all, actually, I would argue, from a purely local authority perspective. From NHS 24, over which there's limited influence from local integrated arrangements, and from the Scottish Ambulance Service, also of which there's very limited local influence. So if these are the routes into hospital, surely to achieve the policy aspirations, the legislation has to look at addressing how they can be realised in that context instead of being silent on them.
Peter?
I just wanted to go back to what Ron was saying. I'm personally, it's not really obvious, I'm absolutely passionate about integration. I'm also passionate about shifting the balance of care, not least because when we talk to our clients or service users or patients, they don't want care in an institutional setting. You know, if they can have care in their own home, if it's possible, that is their strongly expressed preference. So, but what I want to say is that despite being passionate about integration and a really firm believer in it, it's not actually going to solve some of our fundamental challenges that are going ahead with the amount of resources that we've got and the demographic change. I think it can make a positive contribution, but it's not going to solve those fundamental problems. And I'm just keen that we remain sighted on that.
Did you want to, sorry, Richie, go on?
Just partly to expand on what Ron had said as well, and I won't revisit the points he's made, but it is this wider question about community planning as an approach as well, and the focus on prevention that supports shifting the balance of care. Certainly, I would agree with Peter that integration can help get in and about some of these challenges more directly, but won't necessarily automatically solve them. The change plans that are around just now are examples about efforts to shift the balance of care that are still uncertain, if you like, in terms of the sustainability of some of the projects that were set up as part of that, which was exactly to tackle some of that earlier intervention work. So I guess just to say, in terms of integration more generally, while the focus on adult social care and health, there are a range of other services that can contribute to getting the outcomes delivered around housing, around parts of children's services, criminal justice. There are a range of other partners that, again, Duncan's reflected on as well. So we need to bear in mind that there will be a formal set of responsibilities through the partnership, but we can't lose sight of that wider world that's out there in terms of how we can influence and shape, and that might come through the joint commissioning strategies particularly, but housing, I would say, is an important part of that.
Nanette, I will get you in, Malcolm.
It's just, I'm not sure how relevant it is for this particular panel, but I was thinking in terms of, you mentioned the community health partnerships, which, I mean, I know one of the reasons that they did fail fairly early on was that they really failed to engage, particularly with general practice, particularly with GPs. And, you know, the hope is that that will improve this time around. So clearly we haven't heard much about that so far in our evidence taking. The other group we haven't heard much about either so far is carers and the actual people on the receiving end. You know, the reason that the legislation is going to be here altogether. What do the people around this table think is going to happen locally? I mean, will this legislation help to facilitate an improvement there or not? Or will it stay the same?
I'll try to answer both of those points. In terms of the first one, and again, colleagues on the table have a different view. If I variation on Peter in terms of myself also being an NHS officer. I think a lot of that comes down to looking at the terms in which we have the relationship with general practice in terms of the model that Duncan's already talked about. I think there's a responsibility on certainly the leadership and the management of the partnership, the current ones and the future ones, in terms of how you engage with professionals of all stripes and persuasions, including clinical professions and including GPs. I think there's also an interesting conversation to be had with the BMA and others in relation to the GP contract nationally and how you have a setup which obliges GPs to be part of, all of them to be part of the discussion. So it's not just the ones who are interested in a particular area. And I think that poses particular challenges because obviously these are also staff and colleagues who are providing services. So the more involved they are in the quote-unquote the management of it, the less time they have available for being part of service delivery. So there's a whole range of tensions in and around that. And I think those are difficult conversations to often have. But I do think it's also terribly easy for some of our clinical colleagues to just kind of say, well, we've not been sufficiently engaged because something was done that we didn't like. I think that there's an onus on all of us to do this better. And I mean all of us. In terms of patients and carers, and indeed service users more generally, I'm thoughtful that to some extent this is one of a number of pieces of legislation that relate to these partnerships, and the other one being the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, and some of the powers that puts on all public bodies, which is really just kind of clarifying the powers or obligations that are already in place for everybody in terms of how we work with our local communities and engage with them. Again, I'm sure everyone on the table will be able to talk lots of examples where we're working very hard to do that. But in terms of complaints we get or complaints that your constituents will bring to you, there's always examples where we could be doing better. I do think, though, it ties into part of Ron's point, though, that in addition to there not being enough financial resource across the public service, we also have a whole range of differing and increasing expectations. And it's how we can have a conversation with the communities at large around this is what you're wholly entitled to getting, you should be expecting to get within the total resources that are available, so that those who need it the most get it, which means that frankly other people who aren't as much need maybe have to wait a bit longer or don't get something to the same extent. So I think there are very, again, difficult conversations, but we won't be able to avoid them going forward, irrespective of these new arrangements or otherwise.
Sir?
I think your observation is absolutely right about CHPs and primary care. I've gone on record, I've had a lot of sessions with GPs recently talking to them about what the integration agenda might offer, but as somebody who was responsible for Edinburgh's CHP for many years, I don't think we did effectively really harness the hearts and minds of general practice in Edinburgh. So it's a failing that I recognise and something that we need to address. There are some very specific things that we're doing locally to try and do that, not least moving back to a locality infrastructure that will have clearly identified managers who they can relate to in a geographical area that also makes sense to them as well. It's building upon what we used to have in, if we go back a while, under local healthcare cooperatives. But there are some policy things there as well, which I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure. I don't think we've fundamentally addressed. I know we've recently moved from a national contract to a Scottish contract, which is really around the margins, but it's still a national Scottish contract. The amount of things that you can determine locally on that is pretty minimal. If we swap that balance between what's determined nationally and what's actually up for local negotiation, that would put the health and social care partnerships into a much stronger relationship with primary care, because we'd actually be pulling a lot of levers that we don't currently control. Having said that, I'm sure if you're taking evidence from the BMA that they would be horrified at the thought of moving away from a national contract. It took quite a lot of persuasion to get them into a Scottish contract, let alone producing a more local one, but that would make an enormous difference. Even a bit of a change in that balance between what money is determined at a national level within that contract and what can be determined locally, even if we changed it to maybe something like an 80-20 split, 80-20% split with 20% determined locally, I think would begin to create a real reason for getting very active engagement with primary care. We haven't talked about carers. I've talked a little bit about end users. Carers are absolutely fundamental. I mean, I've said on many occasions, and you'll all know the numbers as well as I do, but if we didn't have carers, you know, if carers just decided tonight to stop, the entire system would crash. You know, and we can never do enough to support that. We're trying to do a lot more. I'm sure every authority is. Certainly my own authority in the last few years has set aside extra dedicated money for carers on top of any of the national things. The other area that we haven't talked about at all, and I was conscious that we didn't talk about it in the first session as well, having sat in and observed that, is we've been, the conversation so far has largely been about two sets of employees. It's been about the NHS and local government. And what we haven't got onto the table at all is the fact that 55% of my social care budget is actually provided externally. And we haven't talked about the role that the private sector or the voluntary sector play within all of this. And it's absolutely fundamental. And that difference as well between one of my services, social care, where 55% is externally commissioned, and the health service where just about 100% is internally commissioned, creates some real issues as well in terms of how we develop those integration plans in future. And I just think that's a very important dimension that we haven't touched on at all.
Suppose yep, Ron.
I agree with all of that, but in addition, to come back to the bill, and I know that we've been critical of some elements of the bill today, but there is a positive idea that it promotes in respect of locality planning and puts legislative force behind that, which will require health and care partnerships to give thought to how they organise themselves locally. Now, clearly they already do that anyway, but to build on something that Richie mentioned earlier, we are at a pivotal moment because it's not just this bill that's currently making its way through the Parliament. The Communities Bill will also see the renewal of community planning. And at the heart of that is not just the superstructure of that and how we plan more effectively for localities using the total resource. It's also about how we engage with communities and give life to the principles that Christie set out in his report. What we therefore need to make sure is that when we engage with communities, whether it's involving GPs, carers, others, that we do that consistently across localities to make sure that on a Monday it's not the health and care people coming to talk to communities on the Tuesday, it's the leisure people on the Wednesday. So that's the potential of community planning. And that's why we've always argued that there needs to be a strong linkage between the two. And I think at that locality level, we can really begin to make inroads into that and see those arrangements develop.
Anyone, any other panel members? Richie?
The question about service users or patients part in this. And while there are the national outcome measures that will be being confirmed as we look ahead, one of the questions we've asked locally is to say that how will we know if we've invested in a different set of cultures, a different set of expectations and services, how will we know that's made a difference? So again, we're looking to see how we can ask the people that directly use the services a kind of now and after kind of scenario, what's their experience now and what might there be experience in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years time. So there is something there about getting, for us anyway, some local intelligence around understanding the impact of the investment we're going to make in these new partnership arrangements.
What's in the bill for carers? How will it change their life? Peter?
I'm not sure I would... I'm not aware of anything specifically about carers, but if you go back to where I started about our aspirations for integration, about creating more joined-up services, quite often it's the carer or it's the person who's got to coordinate services in their home. And I hope that through, not through the legislation, but through the work that we're undertaking in Edinburgh, that we can actually change that quite fundamentally and that we actually become the ones who are coordinating that care and do it far more effectively. You know, I often think of the person who's juggling the appointments between home care or district nursing and the variety of people that might be coming into their own home. Individual carers shouldn't be doing that. That's our responsibility to make that more effective and more seamless. And I think the bill's aspirations, its policy intent, is all about trying to make that much more joined up, much more effective.
Should the bill say more then about carers' rights and patient rights and more positive enforceable rights there that can help to change this culture? If we accept legislation can do it in part, shifting budgets can do it in part, working together can do it in part, you know, why not greater enforceable rights for patients? We had an answer to this in a private session, but it wasn't a very good one. Ron?
I'm under pressure now. Because I think the answer lies in commissioning, in good commissioning practice. So rather than identify rather rigidly what people can expect, what we actually should be putting our energy into is good commissioning practice. And as the members of this committee know, that is developing across Scotland. You've heard critical reports in the past of commissioning capacity in social work and in health, and we recognise that that's an area of improvement. But that's where I think the expression of support for carers has to be articulated in terms of how we use our resources more creatively, especially that bit about, you know, we've mentioned a couple of times today already, disinvest to reinvest. Try and get more of that money upstream to support carers, to support the people in their lives, to make sure that they don't then have to draw down on formal services, especially the more expensive ones in secondary care. good commissioning plans, I think, will be able to take us in that direction. And that will crucially be based on an analysis of local population need, and will be able to engage with local groups of carers and other populations as well. So I think that's where the answer lies, actually, rather than a fairly rigid articulation of entitlement.
That's what really interested me, because when I speak to all the people involved, they don't like the idea of these patient rights, enforceable rights at all. That's what encourages me to keep asking that question. But I mean, you know, if more of this care is to be delivered in the community, then from health, that we know in health, and it's well established, the importance of continuity of care doesn't apply in the community. 7 carers in and out of your home, different people at weekends, strangers coming in, that doesn't apply. Why doesn't it apply? You know, the right to be treated by an appropriately qualified person, not somebody who's just been recruited at the weekend. There are a number of these issues that come to us through casework that wouldn't apply you know, in a hospital, in an NHS setting, although sometimes they do. You know, you know, if we're going to see more people treated in the community that are not protected by these rights if they had been in a hospital setting, there's an inequity, a worry there, that, and perception there that what they're going to get is something that is less valuable, not of the same quality, etc., etc. And commissioning and procurement, unfortunately, has worked in some cases to the detriment of people. Suman, Ron's wanting back in again. I'm glad of that.
As an observation, there is a Patient Rights Act. So first, and I think other people would note, there are other instruments, legal instruments and otherwise, that kind of address those kind of issues. Picking up Ron's point in terms of the commissioning plan, also the fact that it comes into the quality of leadership and management within a particular area, irrespective of the management structure around it, around how you want to provide your services. And again, it comes this element of would you want that put down in legislation, or if really that's a policy intent, and really that's down to the calibre of the people on the ground providing the service and how we're providing it. Everyone knows the value, everyone says they know the value around continuity of care. At the same time, everyone's also talked about in the scope for innovation, and one of the downsides, the unintended consequence of being too prescriptive around certain types of entitlements is that effectively it negates the scope for innovation in terms of different types of service models, particularly over time, and particularly where needs and resources within different areas will vary.
With that, and I can understand why people will search for guarantees, and I can understand as well why it's attractive for parliamentarians and other politicians to want to discuss the language of guarantees. I think that the challenge is that the consequence of that is that it creates rigidity in terms of the use of public sector resource. The major strength of this bill is that it creates flexibility in terms of the use of that resource, that we can look at the total pot and use that money differently. If everything's nailed down, it's hard to do that. So that's why I think if we can ensure that we've got that flexibility, build the capacity to ensure that we improve in respect of the commissioning agenda, and I agree that we've got more to do there, but what we'll see is the gradual improvement of support to carers and other population groups that absolutely require that.
Stem from a question about what people who are recipients of care get. I mean, I think that's a focus that we have, and some of we did, I think, completed a very good report on elderly care here at this committee now 2 years ago, where we identified some of the issues at commission and procurement, the quality of the workforce, what they should expect, and indeed how we train them and how we pay them as well was all a part of that. A good read for holidays. Malcolm Chisholm.
I wanted to ask people about acute care, because I think it came through as one of the strongest themes in all the submissions today, that has to be centrally involved, particularly the resources from there, and that came through in the statements that have been made. So from my point of view, that's going to be one of the most interesting things in the bill, and so I'm interested in what model, because it seems to me this could be done in a good way or in a bad way, because I think acute care has to be involved. But I know there are fears in the health service that you could create a situation if they're not part of if it's the corporate body model that we're going for a minute, that if they're not part of that, you're almost in danger of reintroducing a commissioner-provider split in Scotland, whereby the corporate bodies would have to negotiate, the two corporate bodies would have to negotiate with the health boards and so on. So we don't want that kind of situation, I don't think, in Scotland, but we do want the acute sector and its resources involved. So I just wondered what model people had in their heads about that. But the second point is, I absolutely think it's the most important thing in health is to shift the balance of care. But if you add up shifting the balance of care and demography, you're not actually going to be able to reduce in absolute terms acute health service budgets. I mean, I probably feel this particularly strongly in Lothian, where we have this massive increase more than elsewhere in the elderly population, doubling in the next few decades. So although Peter's saying we've got step-down beds paid for by the NHS, we also have extra acute beds paid for by the NHS. So as you shift the balance of care, you're not going to be able to reduce acute budgets because of the demography. So that, I think, has to be taken into account, because I think there is in some of the submissions, I'm almost thinking, people are thinking there's going to be the acute sector is actually going to be able to reduce its resources into this. And I just don't see that happening, certainly in this part of the world. It might be able to happen in other parts of Scotland. So in view of those factors, I just wonder what model people have of that involvement of the acute sector.
Peter. I'll start by absolutely agreeing with you that very much aspire to shift the balance of care to try and get less our resources in the acute sector, less in institutional settings. Clear evidence of us doing that if we look at the national performance indicators. But overall, given the challenges that we're facing, I don't think the acute sector, it's going to be incredibly challenging to maintain the acute sector with a given number of beds right now, given the demography that we're facing. We've been looking at this strategically. We're working on a whole system comprehensive plan. That plan shows that at present, if the current rise in emergency medical admissions, if that trend continues, then we'll actually continues unabated, and clearly we don't want that to happen. But if that trend continues unabated, we'll require 800 more beds within the system. Now, the issue is, to what extent do we think we can actually affect that gradient? I don't think we're going to reduce the gradient down to zero. I think it'd be a heroic and foolish assumption to do so. But it's to what extent can all the work that we're doing through integration, through better and scheduled care, through providing alternatives to admission, through getting people through the system faster, to what extent can we reduce that gradient? But the gradient is still there. So if anybody's got a notion that there's massive sums of money to be saved in the acute sector and shifted over into health and social care, certainly from all the analysis that we've done within Lothian, that's not the case. What we want to do is to work collectively to see how we can cope with the pressures that are in the system at present are going to continue over the next 10 to 15 years. And in terms of the model, I personally don't have the model in my head, and I've yet to meet the person who does. Maybe there are people around who do. I absolutely want to get I absolutely do feel that we have to look at this in a whole system. So acute absolutely need to be around the table, and the health and social care partnerships need to have much more influence over them than the community health partnerships had. Now, moving away from that statement and then saying, well, how do you actually do it? I couldn't tell you the how bit at present. We'll make it work in Lothian, but I couldn't tell you prescriptively what does the model look like right now. We've also got the issue, a bit like Duncan was saying in North Lanarkshire, that for me it's relatively straightforward. The vast majority of Edinburgh residents, not all, but the vast majority are cared for in Edinburgh. But those Edinburgh hospitals are also supporting people from East Lothian, Mid Lothian, West Lothian, and for some of their services, they're supporting people in South East Scotland. For some of them, they're supporting them for the whole of Scotland. So there are three different dimensions to it, to acute care. There's the tertiary specialist thing, which really health and social care are not very involved in. There's the scheduled care, which we're involved in terms of trying to influence demand. So the primary care component of that is really important because it's primary care who make the referrals. But the third dimension, and it does split into kind of equal thirds, the third dimension that is the most important dimension for the partnerships is unscheduled care, emergency medical admissions. That's the area we really want to get in and about. And are doing, I think I've given an example of that earlier on today.
To Ron, who wants a minimum share of the acute budget to go to the integrated models, integrated budget, don't you, Ron?
Absolutely.
Right, let me hear it.
So I mean, I agree, this is a pivotal question, and I think there's a number of things or observations we would want to make around about that. The first is the way the bill is constructed under the body corporate model. The joint board will, in relative terms, be insulated from the two parent bodies. So in other words, what it does is it invests power and authority in the joint board to design a commissioning plan and then to see the implementation of that. And the reason that my colleagues in the NHS are slightly nervous about that is that it's within the gift of that joint board to say, we want to use the acute sector differently. We don't want to use as much of it, perhaps, whatever. But the point is, it brings together all those collective resources into a single place and allows them to make that type of decision. Because the health board doesn't sign off on the commissioning plan, that's where those fears emerge. So in other words, what they worry about is that the budget for the acute sector is disaggregated because, after all, most health boards have more than one partnership within their territory, disaggregated between a number of partnerships and then reaggregated based on their preferred commissioning model and consumption patterns, and all of that doesn't add up to the amount of money that they need to run the hospital. So that's a genuine issue in there which we need to get past. But we have been working on that, and I think there will be a solution to that. What I'm confident of is that the solution won't be the retreat of the acute sector to something else, to sit aside all of this. I think it has to be at the heart of this and how we use that resource. And actually, over the last few years, the work that's been undertaken in respect of the integrated resource framework, what that demonstrates actually is that there is huge variation in terms of patterns of consumption from GP practices in terms of referrals to the acute sector. And the argument is, if we can try and reduce that variation, then there will be some capacity to use resources differently. However, the bigger point, and I think you come to the same conclusion logically that we come to, is that of itself, integration isn't going to solve this problem because of the changing structure of the population. And actually, over time, we need a conversation about how people are willing to pay for care into their older age.
But do you stick to the argument that you can't bring about that redesign unless you almost argue that you need to take some money out of that, and that will bring about the redesign? A minimum,
absolutely. And where our discussions are, I mean, I think probably what we want to look at is the unscheduled care, the emergency pathway, which eats up about, I don't know, a third of the total resource. That's going to be pivotal. And therefore, the thing that I think we need to do is to explore what that pathway then involves. So it's not just about front door services in accident and emergency. It's about all the subsequent parts of acute general hospitals which then become involved. So general medicine, maybe some elements of psychiatry, and so on. And I think once you begin to think about that in those terms, you are talking about a substantial part of the acute budget being in scope. And I think it needs to be that way. I think it needs to be that way because if it's not, nothing changes. And if we go through all of the pain of integration and nothing changes, then I don't know what we've done it for.
Who would work out the minimum then? What would a minimum figure be? What would be?
Peter and I will do it.
I'm sure you would, but I'm sure those in the acute sector would may not agree with you. Duncan.
I think because it's such a difficult question to answer, we all wrestle with the right solution. But the start of the problem, or the start of the analysis of the problem, surely has to be: what is it that happens in acute hospitals that can only happen in an acute hospital environment? What is it that happens in an acute hospital environment that could happen elsewhere? And there will be some points of clarity at both ends of the spectrum, and then some points of debate and grey areas in the middle. But if we don't do that, then we start from quite a pessimistic position that actually we can't do any of those things that happen in an acute hospital anywhere else. And if we assume that position, we won't explore telehealth, for example, which is untapped in large parts of Scotland and better developed in others. So we have to, I think, start from that position before we can form an actual a meaningful conclusion on how services are organised. And we have to see this as part of a whole system of which the acute sector is a critical element. And one of the issues in the acute sector is that we have, or both actually across acute and primary care, is that we have old age psychiatry often sitting here and geriatric medicine sitting there. And many of the people who are supported and treated through the geriatric medicine strand of activity will have significant cognitive problems, significant dementia. And it's arguably sometimes, I suspect, if you had those people in the room and tried to guess which side of the house they were being treated through, it wouldn't always be straightforward to identify them. So that's quite a significant area of potential integration and development that we probably, maybe it's been explored in some health areas more than others, but it's certainly a challenging area. The other thing in terms of that minimum, the question, what is the minimum? Well, you could say the minimum is just your geriatric specialities, your care of the elderly medicine. But actually, it's a very small part of a acute hospital service, and it's a very small part of most older people's experiences. Most older people won't go actually near that speciality, nor should they. But what happens is elsewhere in the acute system is that typically somebody will fall. They will have been living well at home with support, often family members, sometimes with statutory support and so on, but with dementia. They will have a fall, they will break their hip. The orthopedic surgeon, doesn't have necessarily the expertise and knowledge about dementia, identifies that the person has got dementia and says to the family, your mother's got significant dementia. I don't know that she should be living at home. And you've started a whole journey there. No specialist in terms of dementia has been anywhere near that person. And that is where, so when we start to talk about minimums, it becomes more difficult because it's that sort of experience, and I know it's easy to describe to a general anecdotal position, but that experience will be familiar to many people who rely on health and social work services. And it's that kind of interrogation that we need before we can come meaningfully to a conclusion about what parts of the acute system to be in it. But I would have thought that if no parts of the acute system are in it, then really we will struggle to achieve the goals of this policy.
Sherman?
I can very much echo what other people have said, but it strikes me there's 3 points worth mentioning. I'm fairly confident my NHS acute colleagues would say that they recognise these kind of issues, so they wouldn't be walking away from it, and they're spending a lot of time thinking about it. And so within my own health board area, Greater Glasgow and Clydach, I've been undertaking a very substantial clinical services review, which have been trying to quantify and grapple with these very issues with a view to reporting later on in the year, because there aren't easy answers to them. Secondly, I think in terms of existing arrangements or indeed the new partnerships, part of the thing is it's important to note here, I don't think it will be in anyone's interest, and I can't imagine any senior management team or leadership team having an invested interest in effectively fracturing acute service provision. I think everyone will be acutely, no pun intended, aware of the need to be thoughtful about how these changes are made, but also the need to work with other colleagues about doing those changes. And again, I'm thoughtful about preliminary work, scoping out what's been undertaken, for example, within Inverclyde, looking within the context of its community health and care partnership with the local hospital, about the nature of the relationship and what the opportunities are there for, again, to that be something that's put on a positive footing. And I think the third thing for me comes down to a question that, well, the question you were just planning earlier about relationship with GPs. And certainly a lot of the work that we've been doing and something conversation I know with clinical colleagues, that one thing that comes out repeatedly again is the relationship between the GP as effectively the gatekeeper with their acute counterparts, their acute consultant counterparts and other services, which to some extent ties into the point that Duncan was making. And if there's something that the promise of locality planning does provide, is around how we can strengthen, facilitate better direct relationships and communication through the use of IT and others, and between clinical staff working in primary care, including GPs, and our acute clinical colleagues across the board, to now, though, effectively to ensure that patients are supported properly in terms of a seamless pathway and are on the right pathway. But part of that also then means understanding that these are highly skilled, technically capable individuals who are able to work it with their own narrow specialties as well, and are there to exercise quite proper clinical judgments in some of these matters. We just need to facilitate that.
Richie?
Yeah, in terms of defining a minimum level of acute service, I think it is difficult and nobody has the easy answer. But to go back to something I said earlier about just that basic question of what are we doing this for? What are we seeking to integrate? What are we seeking to improve? And if that helps inform then the debate about which components of acute services may be better in scope than out of scope, then I think that would be a helpful way forward. So rather than necessarily talking about territorial, the budgetary components of this, it's coming back to the outcomes again. So what actually would make a difference to people receiving our services jointly that we should bring into scope, and which parts of acute would fall into that kind of sector.
Well, we've come to the end of this session, and can I thank you all for your attendance, your participation and your views and your written evidence. And I'd like to think that this is obviously an ongoing situation in the evidence. If you see evidence that you strongly agree with or more likely strongly disagree with, then we are keen to receive that through the clerks. Once again, thank you all for your attendance this morning. Thank you very much. Close the meeting.